Hello everyone. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Before we begin, make sure you like and subscribe, and comment down below where in the world you are watching from, and at what time. Now let's begin. The forest felt too quiet. Nathan didn't notice it at first. The long drive, the winding dirt roads, and the excitement of the trip had kept his mind occupied. But now, as he stepped out of the truck and stretched, the stillness wrapped around him like a damp, heavy blanket. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of insects, just silence. He frowned, rubbing the back of his neck as he glanced toward Olivia, who was already unbuckling her seatbelt. She hadn't seemed to notice. "Smell that," she said, stepping out and inhaling the crisp evening air. "That perfect mix of pine and wet earth. I love it." Nathan forced a smile. Maybe he was overthinking it. They had been planning this camping trip for weeks. A weekend escape into the deep woods of Michigan. Far from work, far from people, far from everything. Olivia had found a remote spot deep in the Hiawatha National Forest, one that barely showed up on any maps. Nathan had been hesitant at first. He liked camping, but something about being miles from civilization always unsettled him. But Olivia, she thrived in places like this. He grabbed the cooler from the truck bed, while she slung her backpack over her shoulder, already scanning the towering trees with eager eyes. The sun was starting to set, staining the sky in streaks of gold and red. "Come on," she said, adjusting her flannel. "Let's find a spot before it gets dark." Nathan followed, crunching through the underbrush as they hiked toward the clearing she had picked out on the GPS. He wanted to shake the weird feeling in his chest, but it clung to him like static. The woods just felt off, too still, too expectant. But he said nothing. They reached the campsite within 10 minutes, a perfect little clearing beside a stream, surrounded by tall trees. Olivia grinned. "Told you it'd be perfect." Nathan forced a chuckle, and set the cooler down. Yeah, just don't make me do all the work." She gave him a playful shove before unrolling the tent. He busied himself gathering firewood, keeping an ear out for any sounds in the distance. Still nothing. As the last light of the sun faded behind the trees, Nathan caught a whiff of something strange. Wet fur. Not the usual damp earth smell of the woods. Something stronger, heavier. It was gone as quickly as it had come. Shaking it off, he returned to the clearing, where Olivia had already started the fire. She was leaning back against her backpack, eyes flickering in the orange glow. "All right, big guy," she said, grinning. "Fire's lit. Now tell me a scary story." Nathan smirked, shaking his head. "Nah, I'm not doing that out here. Last thing I need is you jumping at every twig, snapping in the dark." "Oh, come on." She nudged him with her foot. "What's camping without a ghost story?" Nathan sighed, staring into the fire. And then, a branch snapped in the distance. Both of them froze. The sound had come from deep in the woods, beyond the tree line. Nathan held his breath, straining to hear anything else. Silence. Probably just an animal. A deer. A raccoon. Then, another snap. Closer. Nathan turned toward the sound, his body tense. Olivia frowned. "That wasn't you, right?" He shook his head slowly. The fire crackled. Then the smell came back. Wet fur. Musky. Rotten. Heavy. Nathan's gut twisted. Something was out there, watching. The stillness in the air wasn't just his imagination. The woods were holding their breath, and so was he. Something had just arrived. The snapping branch was followed by another. Closer. Nathan's fingers twitched as he resisted the urge to grab Olivia's arm. His eyes darted toward the tree line, searching for movement, for anything that would explain the sound. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on the trunks beyond their camp. The trees stood still, silent, but something was out there. Nathan swallowed hard. "Probably a deer," he muttered, forcing his voice to stay even. Olivia didn't look convinced. She turned toward the woods, her expression shifting from playful to tense. "I don't know," she whispered. It sounded heavy. Nathan had noticed that too. Too much weight. A deer was quick, light, but whatever was moving out there wasn't. The smell of wet fur hit him again, stronger this time, like something had been rolling in stagnant water. He clenched his jaw. "Stay here," he muttered, Before Olivia could argue, Nathan grabbed the flashlight from the tent and stood, directing the beam toward the trees. The light wavered slightly. As he aimed it into the darkness, the thick underbrush swallowed most of it, only revealing gnarled trunks and twisting branches. The woods stretched on endlessly, black and shifting, the shapes of trees morphing in the flickering light. Nothing moved. No eyes caught the glow. No shape darted between the trees. Just emptiness. Nathan exhaled, his breath coming out colder than it should have. He turned back to Olivia. See, probably, something exhaled. A low, heavy breath, right behind him. Nathan froze. His stomach dropped as a warm gust of air brushed against the back of his neck. Something was there. Close. Too close. He spun around, flashlight shaking. Nothing. Just the trees, the underbrush, the darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs. His skin crawled with something primal. Something screaming at him to run. But there was nowhere to run. Not out here. Not this deep in the woods. The exhale had been real. He had felt it, had smelled the hot, rancid breath curling over his shoulder. But nothing was there. Nathan took a slow, shaky step backward. Returning to the fire, Olivia had stood up now, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. What was that? She asked. Nathan forced himself to lie. Wind. She didn't buy it. Neither did he. But what else could he say? They sat back down, the fire suddenly feeling too small, too weak. Nathan forced himself to eat, shoving bites of food into his mouth just for the sake of doing something. Olivia barely touched hers. The night stretched on. The sounds didn't return. Eventually, Olivia leaned into his shoulder, her breathing slowing as sleep started to take her. Nathan stared into the flames, his mind racing. The silence never lifted. The smell never went away. And in the woods just beyond the reach of the firelight, something was still watching, waiting, hungry. The fire had burned low, shrinking into glowing embers. Nathan hadn't moved for over an hour. Olivia had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her breathing slow and steady, but his eyes stayed fixed on the tree line. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. The night pressed against him, thick and heavy. The darkness beyond the fire felt almost solid, like if he reached into it, his hand might be pulled in. The wind had died completely. Even the trees didn't move. Nathan exhaled slowly. He was being paranoid. He had to be. He was exhausted. The long drive and the hike, catching up with him. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But the smell, that thick, damp, musky, wet fur stench, still lingered in the air, like it was closer. His grip on the flashlight tightened. He flicked it on, directing the beam toward the trees again. His chest tightened. The woods had changed. Before, the trees had been scattered. There had been clearings, open spaces between the trunks. But now, they seemed closer together. The gaps between them had shrunk. The woods looked denser. Nathan swallowed hard, adjusting his grip on the flashlight. That didn't make sense. Trees didn't move, did they? A crack echoed from the darkness. Not just a branch snapping, something pressing down into the earth. Nathan held his breath. Another step, then another. The sound of weight shifting. Something big. He slowly reached for Olivia, pressing his hand against her shoulder. "Liv," he whispered. She stirred but didn't wake. The footsteps stopped. Nathan's pulse hammered in his throat. It was watching. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there. A feeling like static crawled across his skin, a heavy weight settling in his chest. His body screamed at him to run. Then, a low growl, deep, guttural. It rattled through the trees, vibrating in his ribs. Not a wolf, not a bear. Something else, something that wasn't supposed to exist. Nathan's breath hitched. The growl rumbled for several seconds, a low primal vibration coming from the darkness. Then, it stopped. Silence. Nathan turned the flashlight toward the trees. The beam shook in his trembling grip, passing over bark, leaves, endless black voids between trunks. And then, eyes. Two massive glowing amber eyes, too high up, higher than any animal should be, staring at him. Nathan couldn't breathe. His entire body locked. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. Then, as if realizing it had been seen, the thing took a step forward, The trees shifted around it. The shape that emerged was wrong. Nathan barely held in a sound. It had the head of a dog, but twisted, unnatural. Its ears pointed, its snout long, but its body. God, its body. It was standing, upright, not like a bear, not hunched, fully standing, too tall, too thin. Its arms hung too long, its clawed hands twitching slightly at its sides. The fur on its chest was matted, blackened with something wet. Nathan couldn't look away. The Dogman didn't move, didn't breathe. Then it smiled. Nathan grabbed Olivia's shoulder hard. She woke with a sharp inhale, sitting up fast. What? Don't make a sound, Nathan whispered, his voice barely there. She turned her head, following his gaze toward the trees. She saw the eyes, and she froze. Nathan didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then the Dogman took a step forward. The ground shook beneath its weight, and then it ran, straight at them. Nathan barely had time to react. The fire exploded as the thing charged, its shadow engulfing the campsite in a split second. And then, darkness. Nathan barely had time to react. Before the darkness swallowed them, the fire collapsed, sending a wave of sparks into the air. As something massive charged into the campsite, Nathan grabbed Olivia's wrist and yanked her away just as the Dogman's shadow rushed over them. A heavy gust of air, thick with the rancid stench of wet fur and blood, slammed into them as they stumbled back. Nathan hit the ground hard, his flashlight tumbling from his grip, landing in the dirt. The beam flickered wildly, swinging toward the trees, and in that brief flash of light, he saw it, too close. The Dogman loomed over the fire pit, its massive twisted body silhouetted against the embers. Its snout curled into that horrifying grin, revealing jagged, yellowed fangs. Its eyes glowed. It wasn't just looking at them, it was enjoying this. Olivia gasped, scrambling backward. Nathan grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the truck. The thing moved, too fast, a blur of black fur and muscle. 1 second it was near the fire. The next it was at the edge of their tent, crouching low. Nathan's vision swam. It was playing with them. His breath hitched as Olivia yanked on his sleeve. Nathan, move. He snapped out of it, stumbling to his feet. His body screamed to run, but his mind locked up. Where? The truck was too far. The trees. No, it was faster than them. Then, as if sensing his panic, the Dogman let out a low, guttural chuckle. It laughed. Nathan felt his stomach twist violently. That was not an animal. It understood. It wanted them to run, and it was going to enjoy the chase. Olivia yanked on his sleeve again, her voice breaking. Nathan. The Dogman charged. Nathan barely had time to shove Olivia out of the way before the thing lunged. Impact. A blur of black fur and crushing weight. Nathan felt claws rake across his chest as the thing slammed into him, sending him sprawling into the dirt. A sharp burning pain flared across his ribs, hot and deep. He gasped, blinking through the dizziness. The thing was on him, pinning him, its massive clawed hands pressed into his shoulders, its weight impossible. Up close, the stench was unbearable. The Dogman lowered its hideous snout toward his face, its hot breath washing over him. Nathan tried to struggle, but the thing held him down effortlessly. Its eyes, its eyes, glowed with something intelligent, amused. It wasn't killing him yet. It wanted him to know. Nathan's breath came in short, ragged bursts. The thing tilted its head. Then, it sniffed him, slowly, deliberately. Nathan's entire body locked up. The Dogman's lips curled. Then, it leaned in closer, and whispered, "Run." Nathan's mind shattered. The thing let go. Nathan didn't hesitate, didn't think. He scrambled to his feet, and ran. Olivia was already ahead of him, her breaths coming in ragged sobs. The truck, that was their only chance. The woods exploded behind them, the sound of branches snapping, earth tearing apart. Nathan didn't dare look back, but he could hear it, following, fast, too fast. The truck was so close. Olivia reached it first, yanking the door open, practically throwing herself inside. Nathan was seconds behind. The ground trembled. The snarling laughter behind him was right there. He lunged for the truck door, and the thing grabbed his ankle. Nathan screamed as he was ripped backward. the force slamming him into the dirt. Pain exploded through his chest as the dogman's claws dug into his leg. It wasn't just trying to catch him, it was toying with him. Nathan kicked wildly, his free foot connecting with something solid. The thing grunted. A split second was all he needed. He wrenched his leg free and lunged for the truck's open door. His hands grasped the seat. Olivia was screaming, reaching for him. Nathan threw himself inside, slammed the door. A thunderous impact rocked the truck as the dogman crashed into the side. The entire vehicle shook. Nathan barely managed to hit the lock button before a massive clawed hand raked across the window, splintering the glass. Olivia was sobbing. "Go, go now." Nathan fumbled for the keys, his hands trembling violently. Another impact. The truck rocked violently, metal groaning under the weight of the monster outside. Nathan jammed the keys into the ignition, turned, the engine roared to life. The dogman let out a piercing, furious howl. Nathan slammed the gas. The truck's tires spun in the mud before catching. They lurched forward, dirt spraying behind them. Nathan gripped the wheel tight, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In the side mirror, a shape tall, black, running alongside the truck. It was still following, still playing. Nathan's mind raced. They weren't getting away, not unless a road. They needed a road. Open space, something this thing wouldn't follow them into. "Hold on," Nathan yelled. He yanked the wheel hard, sending the truck barreling through the trees. Branches slammed against the windshield, the tires skidding over uneven ground. Behind them, the howling never stopped. It was still there, still hunting, and Nathan had a terrible feeling. This wasn't just one of them. It was never just one. The truck barreled through the forest, bouncing violently over roots and uneven ground. Branches lashed against the windshield, scraping across the glass like claws. Nathan could barely keep control, his hands slick with sweat, gripping the wheel too tight. Beside him, Olivia was curled against the door, her eyes wide, her breaths coming in ragged sobs. "Is it still there?" Nathan shouted, his voice barely rising above the roar of the engine. Olivia turned, eyes darting to the side mirror. Then, her face went pale. "Oh my God." Nathan didn't look. He didn't need to. He could hear it, pounding footsteps, faster than they had any right to be. The dogman was still running alongside them. Nathan clenched his jaw, slamming the gas harder. The truck lurched forward, bouncing wildly over the terrain. The tires skidded, mud spraying behind them. The road where the hell was the road? They weren't going to outrun this thing. The sound of clawed hands slamming against metal sent a bolt of terror through his spine. It was closer. Olivia let out a choked scream as something massive slammed against the side of the truck, sending it swerving violently. Nathan fought the wheel, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Where's the road?" he shouted, eyes darting ahead. Trees, endless trees. They were going deeper into the woods. No escape. Another impact. This time on the roof. The metal groaned as something heavy landed on top. Nathan barely had time to process it before claws raked across the roof, sending screeching metal shards flying. The weight shifted. Something was crawling up there, moving toward the driver's side. Nathan couldn't breathe. Then, a single clawed hand slammed against the driver's window. Nathan jerked, his foot nearly slipping off the gas. The fingers were long, too long. They dragged across the glass, leaving deep, jagged scratches. Then, slowly, a face appeared. Nathan's stomach dropped. The dogman was clinging to the side of the truck. It grinned, lips pulling back over massive yellowed teeth. It wasn't just hunting, it was toying with them. Olivia was sobbing. "Nathan, do something." His pulse roared in his ears. He had seconds to react. He made a choice. Nathan jerked the wheel hard. The truck swung violently to the left, tires skidding, mud spraying up in all directions. The sudden movement sent the dogman crashing into the trees. A sickening crack echoed through the night as the beast collided with a thick trunk. Nathan slammed the gas again, adrenaline blinding him. "Road! Road!" Olivia screamed, pointing ahead. Nathan's eyes locked onto it. A dirt road cutting through the forest, leading back to civilization. They had a chance. The truck burst onto the road, tires screeching as they hit solid ground. Nathan yanked the wheel straight, pushing the speedometer as far as it would go. The forest whipped past them. The road stretched ahead, leading them away. Nathan's chest heaved. They were alive. They had made it. Then, a sound, a howl, deep, echoing, not from behind them, from ahead. Nathan's stomach turned to ice. Lights flickered in the distance. A town, civilization, safety. But standing in the middle of the road, waiting for them, was another Dogman. Bigger, taller. Its arms hung low, claws dragging against the asphalt. It wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the darkness behind it. More of them. Nathan's breath caught. His hands shook. They weren't being chased. They had been herded straight into a trap. Olivia whispered, her voice barely there. Nathan. Nathan's hands tightened on the wheel. The creatures stepped forward. The road ahead was gone. There was no way out. The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. Nathan's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. The road ahead was blocked. The dogmen were waiting. The largest one stood in the center of the road, its massive twisted form illuminated by the truck's headlights. Its fur was thick, dark, matted with something wet. Its eyes glowed. Behind it, shadows shifted. More of them, waiting, watching, ready. The blood roared in Nathan's ears. His mind screamed at him to react. But how? They couldn't turn back. Not into the woods. They couldn't go forward. They were trapped. Olivia's voice shook. Nathan, what do we do? The big one tilted its head. Then, it took a step forward. Slow, deliberate. Nathan's pulse slammed against his ribs. His body locked up. The thing smiled. Nathan knew that look. It knew they had nowhere to go. It knew they weren't escaping. This wasn't a random attack. This was a game. Nathan's breath came out ragged. His thoughts scrambled for a way out. And then, the big one moved. Fast. Too fast. It lunged. Nathan. Olivia screamed. He floored it. The truck roared forward. Nathan barely had time to register what he was doing before the impact hit. The dogman slammed into the hood with a thunderous crunch. Nathan's world jerked violently. The windshield shattered as the massive body rolled up the hood, its claws scraping deep into the metal. Nathan didn't stop. He kept the gas pedal down, gripping the wheel as the truck plowed through. Something cracked. A horrible guttural snarl ripped through the night. Nathan barely saw the dogman's massive body fling sideways before the truck spun out of control. Tires skidded. The world tilted. The truck veered off the road and smashed into the trees. Everything went dark. Silence. For a moment, Nathan felt nothing, just the distant ringing in his ears, the distant sound of his own breath. Pain stabbed through his ribs. His vision blurred. Smoke curled from the crumpled hood. The dashboard lights flickered weakly. Nathan groaned, blinking through the haze. The seatbelt had held him back, but the impact had still rattled his entire body. Beside him, Olivia. Was she okay? He turned, his pulse spiking. She was slumped forward, hair hanging over her face, her breathing shallow. Nathan's heart clenched. Liv, Olivia. She stirred, groaning softly. And Nathan. Relief flooded him. She was alive, but they weren't safe. Not yet. Nathan tried the ignition. Nothing. The engine was dead. They were stuck. Nathan's vision cleared. He turned toward the road, toward where the dogman had been, and his stomach dropped. The road was empty. The thing was gone. Nathan's pulse pounded in his skull. It wasn't dead. It was still out there, waiting, watching, and it wasn't alone. Nathan forced his breath to steady. They had to move. Now, he turned back to Olivia, his hands shaking as he reached for her seatbelt. Liv, we gotta. A low exhale from outside the truck. Nathan froze. His head turned slowly. A shape loomed outside Olivia's window. Massive, breathing. The glass was fogging over from its breath. Nathan's stomach tightened. Then, the clawed hand slammed against the window. A single yellowed claw dragged across the glass, carving deep, slow scratches. Nathan's body locked. The thing was here, and it was toying with them again. Olivia let out a weak whimper. Nathan. The dogman crouched lower, and for the first time Nathan saw it up close. The eyes, massive, Intelligent. Not a mindless beast. Something worse. Nathan's breath hitched. The thing tilted its head. Then slowly, it smiled. A twisted inhuman grin. Then it spoke. "Come out." Nathan's world shattered. His mind refused to process it. The thing had talked. Not a growl. Not a snarl. Words, spoken in a deep guttural, almost human voice. Nathan's entire body locked. It understood. It wanted them to know. There was no escape. Then, the door handle moved. The thing was opening the door. Nathan snapped back into reality. He grabbed Olivia and lunged for the passenger side. The moment he did, the window exploded. A massive arm swung through the shattered glass, claws slashing the air where Nathan had just been. The Dogman's snarl rattled through the night. Nathan yanked Olivia toward the broken passenger door, kicking it open. "Go! Run!" They stumbled out, feet slamming into the dirt. The forest stretched ahead, dark, endless, suffocating. But it was their only choice. Behind them, the Dogman ripped the truck apart. Metal screeched. Glass rained down. The thing howled, an angry, monstrous sound. Nathan grabbed Olivia's hand and ran. Branches lashed against their faces. The ground tore beneath their feet. The forest swallowed them whole. And behind them, the hunt had begun again. Nathan ran. The forest rushed past in a blur. Branches whipping against his arms. Roots catching at his feet. His breath came in ragged gasps. His legs burning with every step. He yanked Olivia along with him, barely keeping them upright as they tore through the trees. There was no path, just endless blackness, the forest stretching on forever. Behind them, the howls followed, low, deep, echoing, not just one, many. Olivia's grip on his hand was tight, her breathing sharp and uneven. She was injured. He could hear the pain in her breaths, the way she stumbled against him. But they couldn't stop. Nathan's thoughts raced. They were in the Dogman's territory now. They weren't just running. They were being chased, hunted. The forest felt wrong. The trees seemed closer together, the shadows moving with them. Nathan didn't know where they were going. Just away, from the thing that had spoken, from the clawed hands ripping into metal, from the monsters hunting them in the dark. Nathan. Olivia choked, her legs buckling. Nathan caught her, barely stopping them from tumbling down a slope. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Olivia, we can't stop," he panted. "We have to keep moving." She shook her head, her face twisted in pain. "I can't." A growl. "Close." Nathan's stomach turned to ice. He turned his head slowly. In the trees, something moved. Low, crouched, waiting. The glow of eyes pierced through the blackness. Nathan's blood ran cold. The Dogman was right there. It had circled ahead of them. It knew where they were going. It had planned this. Nathan's pulse slammed against his skull. He stepped in front of Olivia, shielding her. The creature didn't move, didn't blink. It was watching, studying. Nathan could barely breathe. This wasn't an animal. This was something else, something smart, something that wanted them afraid. Another growl rumbled from behind. Nathan's chest tightened. They were surrounded, trapped. He turned his head, scanning the trees. More eyes. They weren't alone. The pack had arrived. Nathan's body locked up. Then, the first Dogman stood, rising from its low crouch, its towering form stepping from the trees. The firelight had made it look big before. But this close, it was massive, easily 8 feet tall. Its muscles shifted beneath the thick fur, its claws twitching at its sides. It was so close, Nathan could see the rise and fall of its chest, the slow tilt of its head. It was deciding, choosing when to strike. Nathan's body screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something, but he couldn't. The thing moved, a slow, deliberate step forward. It wanted him to break, to make a mistake, to give it a reason to lunge. Nathan's breath shuddered. Then, from the darkness, a sound, a whistle, low, piercing. The Dogman stopped, its ears twitched. Nathan's breath hitched. The whistle came again, sharp, deliberate, from deeper in the woods. The Dogman turned. The glow of its eyes flickered. Then, it snarled, a deep, throaty growl, a sound of pure frustration. And then, the shadows moved. The dogman melted into the trees. The eyes disappeared. The growls faded. Nathan and Olivia were alone again. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Olivia collapsed against him. Nathan barely caught her before she hit the ground. Her body was shaking. So was his. What just happened? She whispered. Nathan swallowed hard. Someone, or something had stopped the dogmen. The whistle, the sound they reacted to. They were afraid of something else. Nathan's hands trembled. He turned his head toward the direction of the sound, toward the deeper part of the forest, toward whatever had saved them. A terrible thought settled in his chest. What if the thing that saved them was worse? Nathan held Olivia tight, feeling her trembling against him. His own body wasn't much better. His hands still shook, his heart pounding against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The dogmen had left, but not because they wanted to. That whistle had stopped them, and now, Nathan and Olivia were alone in the dark, with no idea who or what had just intervened. The forest was silent, not the eerie, unnatural silence from before, but different, a silence of something waiting. Nathan turned his head toward the sound's direction. The trees loomed in shadow, stretching into the unknown. It didn't feel safe, but nothing about this place ever had. He swallowed hard, steadying his breath. Liv, can you stand? She hesitated, then nodded weakly. Nathan helped her up, his hands firm around her arms as she winced. She was exhausted, injured. They couldn't keep running forever. Nathan's mind raced. The truck was destroyed. The dogmen were still out there, somewhere, and whoever had just saved them, they had to be close. Maybe that meant a way out, or maybe they had just traded one nightmare for another. Nathan's pulse hammered. They had no choice. We follow it, he said. Olivia turned to him, eyes wide. What? The whistle. He licked his dry lips. Whatever it was, it stopped them. We don't have another option. Olivia hesitated, glancing toward the deep woods. Her body tensed. Then, she nodded. Nathan didn't wait. He adjusted her arm over his shoulder and started moving, guiding them through the trees. Every step felt wrong, like something was waiting ahead, watching. Nathan's stomach turned. They weren't out of this yet. The forest grew denser the farther they went. The trees stood too close together. The moon barely pierced through the branches. The air smelled different, older, like they were walking into somewhere they shouldn't be, somewhere that had been forgotten. Nathan's grip on Olivia tightened. Then, he saw it. A light, flickering, deep in the trees, barely visible through the fog. Nathan stopped. So did Olivia. A cabin, old, weathered, sunken into the ground like it had been there for a century. The windows glowed dimly, the soft flicker of a fire inside. Nathan's heart pounded. They weren't alone. They approached slowly. The closer they got, the more wrong it felt. The air was thick, heavy. The door was old, its wood splintered and warped from age. But someone lived here, and they had called off the dogmen. Nathan hesitated at the threshold. Olivia's breathing was shaky. Are we really doing this? She whispered. Nathan swallowed hard. Then he knocked. For a moment, nothing. Then the sound of movement. Heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Nathan's chest tightened. The door creaked open, and standing in the dim glow of the fire was an old man. His face was weathered, deep wrinkles carving through his skin like the lines of an old map. His eyes were dark, sunken, but filled with something sharp, something that had seen too much. His clothes were old, leather, and heavy fabric, stitched together over decades, and slung over his shoulder was a rifle. For a moment he just stared at them. Nathan felt the weight of his gaze. The old man finally sighed. "Get inside," he muttered. Before they changed their minds, Nathan didn't hesitate. He helped Olivia inside, stepping over the threshold, his chest tight with tension. The door closed behind them. The warmth of the fire washed over him. For the first time that night, Nathan felt like he could breathe. But then, the old man turned to him, his eyes dark, tired, and he spoke words that made Nathan's blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come here." Nathan's stomach dropped. "The dogmen?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old man shook his head. "No," he said. "The forest. Nathan's breath hitched. The fire crackled in the silence. Then, the old man sat down and began to tell them the truth. They've always been here, the old man said. The Dogman. He poked at the fire absently, his eyes lost in distant memories. Nathan and Olivia sat stiffly across from him, neither daring to interrupt. I moved out here a long time ago, the old man muttered. Heard the stories, never believed him, thought it was just nonsense. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Then I saw one with my own eyes. Olivia shifted uncomfortably. Nathan felt her fingers dig into his arm. The old man exhaled, his jaw tightening. They don't just hunt, he said. They play, they wait, they watch. He turned his sharp gaze toward them. And when they find someone they like, they don't let him go. A cold chill ran through Nathan's spine. He didn't have to ask what that meant. The Dogman had been toying with them for hours. Nathan's voice was hoarse. You stop them. The old man was silent for a moment. Then, he nodded. They don't bother me anymore, he muttered. Learned how to make him listen. Olivia's eyes widened. How? The old man didn't answer right away. Then, his hand reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn whistle. Nathan's chest tightened, the same whistle that had called off the Dogman. The old man turned it between his fingers. Then he exhaled. There's a price, he muttered. Nathan's blood ran cold. A price. He had stopped the Dogman. But for how long? Before Nathan could ask, a howl echoed through the trees. Close. The old man's expression darkened. They're still out there, he muttered. Nathan's pulse pounded. The hunt wasn't over. Not yet. And the Dogmen, they were waiting for their game to begin again. The cabin stood alone, deep in the woods where the trees grew too close together. Their branches tangled like grasping fingers. The only road leading in was narrow and overgrown, winding through miles of dense forest before ending in front of the small, weather-worn structure. No other houses, no cell service, no way out, except the road they came in on. They had come here for a weekend getaway, a break from the monotony of city life. Noah, Rachel, Wes, and Lisa, 4 friends who had known each other since college, now in their late 20s, struggling with jobs, relationships, and the slow suffocation of adulthood. This place is perfect, Rachel had said when they first arrived. No distractions, no stress, just us, the fire, and the open air. It had seemed that way at first, but now, on the second night, something felt off. The forest was too quiet, not just the absence of people, but everything. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, no distant hoot of an owl, just an eerie, absolute silence, pressing against them like something waiting. Noah was the first to notice it. Sitting by the fire, he had stared out into the darkness, his beer forgotten in his hand. Something's wrong, he had murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The woods are too quiet. Lisa, always the rational one, had scoffed. It's late. Maybe the animals are just sleeping. But the silence wasn't natural. It was too thick, too deliberate, like a sound had been removed from the world rather than simply absent. Then there was the feeling, the sensation of being watched. It was subtle at first, a creeping unease that slithered beneath the skin, making the hairs on their arms stand up despite the warmth of the fire. Rachel felt it next. She had been tending to the flames when she froze, her head slowly turning toward the tree line. Did you hear that? She whispered. No one had, because there had been nothing to hear. But that was the problem, wasn't it? The longer they sat there, the more it became clear. The woods weren't just quiet. They were listening, and something was out there, watching, waiting, and getting closer. Noah was the first to see it. It had been a fleeting thing, just a shape between the trees, barely distinguishable from the shadows. Tall, too tall. At first he had thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, the way darkness could make a cluster of branches look like a figure. But then, he blinked, and it was closer, still partially obscured, still hidden just enough to make him question himself. He opened his mouth to say something, then stopped, because the moment he acknowledged it, the pressure in the air changed, like the very act of noticing it had made it real. A chill crawled up his spine. He turned to the others. his voice lower now. "I think there's someone out there." Rachel's eyes widened. Wes scoffed. "Yeah, okay. A random guy just hanging out in the middle of the woods, miles from civilization." But then Lisa saw it too. She gasped, gripping Wes's arm. "Oh my God." The group turned as one. But there was nothing there. Just the trees, the whispering, unmoving trees. The tension thickened. Noah swallowed hard, staring into the darkness, his pulse pounding against his ribs. It had been there. He was sure of it. But now, the only thing looking back at him was the vast, empty forest. Rachel shuddered. "Maybe we should go inside." Wes scoffed. "Come on. You really think there's some random creeper just standing in the woods?" "Noah, you probably just..." A branch snapped. Loud. Too loud. Like something big had just taken a step. The sound came from behind them. They spun around. Nothing. But Noah knew, deep in his bones, that something was there. Something was closer now. Something that only moved when they weren't looking. And then, Lisa did something she shouldn't have done. She took out her phone, held it up, turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. And then, it moved. Not away. Toward them. Not running. Not creeping. Just stepping. Closer. Closer. Noah's breath locked in his throat. The light flickered. The phone died. And in that fraction of a second before everything went dark, they all saw it. A figure. Not human. Not right. Too tall. Too thin. Limbs too long. It had no eyes. No features. But it was looking directly at them. And then, the fire went out. The cabin door slammed shut. And the woods erupted with a whispering sound. Like dozens of voices speaking all at once. A single phrase. Over. And over. "You see it now. You see it now. You see it now." Noah turned to run. And the last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed them all was the thing stepping forward. And this time, it wasn't going to stop. The fire had gone out in an instant, leaving them in suffocating darkness. The cold settled in quickly. An unnatural kind of chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was heavy, pressing against their skin, worming its way into their bones. Rachel clutched Noah's arm, her fingers ice cold. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the whispering, rising and falling in an eerie, rhythmic murmur that came from all around them. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rustling of trees. It was voices, dozens of them. They were not alone. Lisa was the first to break, fumbling blindly in the dark. "My phone." Her voice trembled as she tried to turn it back on. It just had died. It was fully charged. Wes pulled out his own phone, swearing under his breath. "Mine too." "What the hell?" Rachel let out a shaking breath. "Noah, where did you see it?" He swallowed, eyes straining in the blackness. It was just beyond the tree line. But then, the cabin door creaked open. No one had touched it. No one had even moved toward it. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Thick, expectant. A heavy pressure filled the air. A sense of something watching, waiting. And then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from inside the cabin. Lisa let out a soft, strangled sound. "No, we all came outside together. We locked the door." Noah knew she was right. He had been the one to turn the key, to check the handle. But the door had opened itself. And now, something was inside. Wes finally spoke, his voice tight. "We're leaving. Right now." No one argued. They moved as one, inching away from the cabin, staying close, their backs almost touching. Noah's heart slammed against his ribs as his foot crunched against the gravel. The road. If they could just make it to the car. Something moved in the trees. Not footsteps, not rustling. A shift, a shadow peeling away from the darkness. It wasn't a person. It was wrong. Rachel gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Lisa took a step back, bumping into Wes. "Don't look at it," she whispered. "If we don't look, maybe it won't." Noah's stomach clenched. "It only moves when we're not looking." Lisa squeezed her eyes shut, her breath coming fast and panicked. "How do you know?" Because he had seen it. He had watched it move the second Lisa's flashlight had flickered out. And now, it was closer. just beyond the dying embers of the fire. Not moving. Not yet. Noah's voice was barely audible. We need to get to the car. Wes nodded, his hand tightening around Lisa's wrist. We go slow, together. We keep our eyes on it. And we don't stop. They started moving. The trees felt taller now, stretching impossibly high, their tangled limbs blotting out the stars. The only light came from the thin sliver of moon, cutting through the branches. The thing didn't move, not at first, but as they walked, it leaned forward, just slightly, just enough for Noah to see it better. It had no eyes, no mouth, no features, just a shape that was almost human, but not quite. Noah fought the overwhelming urge to blink. They were halfway to the car when Rachel screamed. Something had grabbed her, hands, ice cold, but not from the thing in the trees. From behind her, Noah whirled around. Rachel was being pulled backward, fingers wrapped around her ankle, dragging her toward the cabin. But there was no one there, just a long dark shadow stretching from inside the open door, curling around her leg like a hand, reaching from the void. Wes lunged forward, grabbing Rachel's arm. "Help me." Noah and Lisa reacted instantly, throwing themselves onto Rachel, pulling her with everything they had. The shadow fought back. It didn't jerk her. It didn't tug. It pulled slowly, deliberately, as if it knew it was stronger than them. Rachel was sobbing now, clawing at the ground. "Please, please don't let it take me." Noah gritted his teeth. "We're not letting go." Lisa screamed as the grip around Rachel's ankle tightened. A deep bruise had already begun to form where the fingers were digging into her skin. Then, a sound, a low inhuman growl, not from the thing in the trees, from inside the cabin. A voice followed, thick and wet, coming from the open door. "You see it now." Noah's vision blurred. The darkness seemed to pulse, growing thicker, heavier, and then, the grip on Rachel's ankle released. She screamed as she scrambled away, dragging herself across the dirt. Lisa pulled her up, sobbing. Wes turned to Noah. "We run." And they did. They sprinted toward the car, legs burning, lungs aching. The whispering returned, a chorus of overlapping voices spilling from the cabin, from the trees, from the very air itself. "You see it now. You see it now. You see it now." The car was just ahead. Noah yanked the door open, heart racing. Lisa and Rachel dove into the back, Wes into the passenger seat. Noah jammed the key into the ignition, his fingers shaking. The car wouldn't start. "Come on," Noah whispered. "Come on, come on." Something stepped onto the road. Lisa screamed. The thing in the trees was in front of them now. Noah's hand slammed against the ignition, twisting the key so hard it nearly snapped. The engine roared to life. The thing moved. Noah slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as they tore down the road. Lisa was crying. Rachel was curled into a ball, shaking. Noah didn't look back. He couldn't, because if he did, he knew it would be closer. They sped through the trees, the road twisting and narrow. The whispering faded behind them. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. Noah risked a glance at the rearview mirror. Nothing, just the long, empty road stretching into the night. Lisa exhaled a shaking breath. "We got away." Rachel choked on a sob. "We got away." Wes ran a hand down his face. Jesus Christ. Noah's grip on the wheel tightened. Something wasn't right. The road wasn't ending. They had been driving for too long. The turn that should have led them back to town wasn't there. Lisa sat up. "Noah, this isn't the way we came." Rachel's voice was a broken whisper. "Why are we still in the woods?" Noah's blood ran cold. The whisper returned, slithering through the air, curling around them like smoke. "You see it now." And then, the car engine died. The headlights flickered, and in front of them, standing in the middle of the road, it was waiting. The car's headlights flickered, struggling to stay on. As the engine stalled, the air inside the vehicle thickened, pressing down on them, suffocating. No one spoke, no one moved. Noah's hands were clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that his knuckles had turned white. He was afraid to look up, because he already knew what he would see. The thing was standing in the middle of the road. It was closer now. Noah forced his eyes up, breath hitching in his throat. There it was, tall, still unmoving, its form barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness, like it was made of shadow itself. It had no eyes, and yet, it was looking at them. Rachel let out a strangled sob. Lisa's breathing was erratic, her hands gripping her own arms so tightly that her nails dug into her skin. Wes was silent, staring forward, lips pressed together in something close to prayer. Noah tried to restart the car. The key turned, the engine choked, but wouldn't catch. Again, nothing. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, his pulse so loud it drowned out everything else. Lisa whispered, "It's not going to let us leave." Noah gritted his teeth. "The hell it's not." He turned the key one last time, and the engine roared to life. The headlights flared, and in that brief moment, before the light could fully illuminate the road, the thing moved. Not a step, not a lunge, just a subtle shift, a distortion in the air, and then suddenly, it was gone. Noah didn't think. He slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement, the car jerking forward, hurtling down the road. Lisa let out a broken sob, turning in her seat to look behind them. It wasn't there, just trees, endless, suffocating trees. Rachel whispered, "We're out." We got out. Noah didn't answer, because something was still wrong. The road should have ended by now. They had been driving for too long. The familiar landmarks, the twisted oak tree near the first bend, the sharp turn by the creek were gone. This wasn't the same road. It wasn't leading out. It was leading them deeper. Noah's grip on the wheel tightened. "Tell me I'm not crazy. Tell me we should have reached the highway by now." Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper. "We should have." Wes checked his phone, even though they all knew it wouldn't work. The screen was black, dead. Noah clenched his jaw. "There has to be a way out. We keep driving." No one argued, but with every passing minute, the road stretched longer, the trees thicker, the air darker, and then Rachel saw it first. Her breath hitched. "Oh my God." Lisa turned. What? And then she saw it too. The cabin, standing just beyond the road, exactly where they had left it. But that was impossible. Noah's stomach turned. Wes let out a shaky laugh. No, that can't be." But it was. The car had been moving forward the entire time. And yet, somehow, some way, they had ended up back where they started. Lisa's hands were shaking. "We never left." The whisper came again, slithering through the air, curling into their ears, soft and cruel. "You see it now." The cabin door swung open, and the darkness inside yawned wide. "Waiting," Lisa screamed. Noah slammed on the brakes. The car died. The headlights flickered out, and in that brief moment of darkness, something stepped onto the road. They couldn't move. It wasn't just fear, though fear clawed at their throats, making every breath feel like swallowing glass. It was something else, the thing that had been in the woods, the thing that moved when they didn't look. It was right there, standing in the middle of the road, closer than ever. Wazen let out a broken whisper. What does it want?" Rachel sobbed, shaking her head. "It doesn't want anything. It just wants us here." Lisa's voice was barely audible. "We can't leave." Noah gritted his teeth. "Like hell we can't." He grabbed the door handle. Wes hissed, "Don't." But Noah didn't care. He threw the door open and stepped outside. The night air was wrong. Too thick, too still. No sound, no wind. The thing didn't move. Noah stared at it, his breath ragged. "What do you want from us?" The whisper returned. "You see it now." Noah's vision blurred. For a split second, the world shifted, and he wasn't on the road anymore. He was inside the cabin, standing at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkened basement. Something breathed in the blackness below, heavy, wet, waiting. Then, Noah was back in the road. Lisa was screaming his name. Rachel was crying. Wes was yelling for him to get back in the car. Noah stumbled backward, his heart hammering. "I saw," but he couldn't finish the sentence, because the thing was gone, and the cabin door had shut on its own. Lisa's voice was hoarse. We have to go back inside." Noah turned to her, horror seizing his chest. "What?" Rachel let out a strangled sob. "It's not letting us go. We keep trying to leave, And we just end up back here. Lisa nodded slowly. We can't escape. Not like this. Her voice was hollow, flat, like she already knew the truth. Noah's stomach dropped. He knew it too. The road wasn't real. The car wasn't real. The only real thing was the cabin, and whatever was inside it. The whisper came again, soft, almost gentle. Come inside. Rachel covered her ears. Please stop. Please stop. Please. Wes was shaking his head. This is a trap. It's a goddamn trap. Lisa opened the car door and stepped out. Noah lunged forward. Lisa, don't. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were hollow. Her voice was not her own. You see it now. And then, Lisa turned and walked toward the cabin. The door swung open, and the darkness inside swallowed her whole. Lisa was gone. She had walked straight into the cabin, the darkness swallowing her without hesitation. The door had shut behind her, and now it stood there, closed and silent, like it had never been opened in the first place. Noah's hands were shaking. Rachel was crying. Wes was frozen. His breath was ragged. His eyes locked on the cabin like if he looked away for even a second, it might move closer. Noah forced his feet to move. He reached for the handle of the car door, yanked it open, and turned to Wes and Rachel. We're not leaving her. Wes didn't look at him. She's already gone. Noah's jaw clenched. You don't know that. Rachel wiped her tear-streaked face, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw her face before she went in. Noah turned to her, dread curling in his stomach. What do you mean? Rachel swallowed hard. She wasn't Lisa anymore. No one spoke. The night air pressed in on them, thick and suffocating. The trees stretched taller, their branches curling toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The wind didn't move. The stars had disappeared. The only thing in the world that felt real was the cabin, and Lisa was inside it. Noah took a step forward. Wes grabbed his arm. Don't be an idiot. Noah shook him off. She's still in there. Rachel let out a broken whisper. What if she's not? Noah turned to her, eyes burning. Then I have to find out. Without waiting for them, he moved toward the front porch. The wooden steps creaked beneath his weight. The door stood open now. It had been shut only seconds ago. The cabin was waiting. Noah stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was wrong. It smelled of damp wood and something rotting. The moment he crossed the threshold, a deep pressure settled over his chest, thick and heavy, like the house itself was pressing against him. The whispering started again, low, constant, a sound that wasn't coming from any one direction. It was coming from everywhere. The shadows stretched long across the wooden floor, shifting even though there was no light to cast them. The fireplace was dead. The embers long since turned to ash. The furniture was untouched, exactly as they had left it. And then he saw it. Lisa's phone, sitting in the center of the floor. Noah bent down, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. The screen was cracked. The backlight flickered for a moment, just long enough for him to see the last message she had typed before her phone had died. 4 words, don't follow me in. Noah's stomach turned. Something creaked upstairs. A single slow footstep. He froze. The whispering stopped. And then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. Noah. His breath hitched. It was Lisa's voice. But something about it was off. It had the right tone, the right pitch, but there was something behind it. Something wearing it. Noah's pulse pounded. His hands clenched into fists. Lisa. Silence. And then, another step from upstairs. Closer. I can't find the door. The voice was quieter now, more distant, like she was calling to him from somewhere far away. Noah turned toward the staircase. The upstairs was dark, impossibly dark, like the shadows up there were deeper than the rest of the house. Wes's voice hissed from outside. Noah, don't. But he was already moving. He climbed the stairs. Each step creaked beneath him, the sound stretching too long, like the wood was groaning in protest. The air grew colder, and the whispering returned, slithering between the walls like something alive. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before him, longer than it should be. The doors were all shut, except for one, Lisa's bedroom. The door was open, but just slightly, a sliver of darkness beyond the frame. Noah's breath came in short, shallow bursts. He took a step forward, and then, something moved inside the room. A shape shifting in the dark, too tall, too thin. Not Lisa. Noah stopped, his heart hammered against his ribs, his blood turning to ice. And then, from inside the room, the thing turned its head. It saw him. The door slammed shut. Noah stumbled back. The whispering grew louder, cascading over itself. Voices layered upon voices, all speaking at once. Something slammed against the door from the inside. A single sharp knock, then another. Then, Lisa's voice again. Noah, open the door. He froze. The voice was wrong, flat, emotionless, like something that had learned how to speak by watching humans from a distance. Noah didn't move. The doorknob turned. Noah stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He ran, down the stairs, through the hallway, out the front door, into the night air. Rachel screamed when she saw him. Noah slammed the door behind him, his chest heaving. Wes's face was pale. What did you see? Noah shook his head. Not Lisa. Rachel sobbed, covering her face with her hands. She's gone. She's gone. The cabin door creaked open behind them. They whirled around. The darkness inside stretched outward, spilling across the porch like a living shadow. And then, Lisa stepped out. Her clothes were the same. Her hair was the same. But her eyes, they were empty, flat, like she was staring at something they couldn't see. Noah's blood ran cold. Lisa took a slow step forward. Rachel whispered, "Lisa." Lisa smiled. But the smile was wrong. It was too wide, and her teeth were too sharp. The whispering surged, rising to a deafening level. Lisa's mouth moved. But it wasn't her voice that spoke. It was all of them. "You see it now." And then Lisa lunged at them. Lisa lunged at them. But it wasn't Lisa anymore. Noah barely had time to react before Wes shoved him backward, his voice breaking. "Run!" Rachel screamed as she turned, feet kicking up dirt as she bolted toward the trees. Noah stumbled, grabbing Wes's arm, yanking him with him as they fled into the woods. Lisa, or the thing wearing Lisa's face, let out a sharp, unnatural laugh. The sound high-pitched and wrong, twisting through the night, like metal scraping against bone. Noah didn't look back. He couldn't. The whispering was everywhere now. Layered voices bleeding through the trees, slithering under his skin. "You see it now. You see it now." Rachel was crying as she ran, her breath ragged, uneven. "Where are we going?" Wes panted beside her. "Away. Just away." But Noah knew. There was no away. The road had brought them back. The trees had trapped them, and the cabin wasn't behind them anymore. It was ahead. Noah's breath hitched as they broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the open clearing. And there it was, the cabin. Again, the front door stood open, gaping wide like a mouth. The darkness inside waiting. Rachel collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "No, no, no, no." Wes grabbed his head, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "This is impossible. This is impossible. ****. Noah spun around. The trees were still behind them. They had run in a straight line. They should have been miles away. But the cabin was here, like it had been waiting for them. The whispering stopped. The silence was so sudden it felt like the world had been sucked dry. And then, a footstep. Noah froze. The sound came from inside the cabin. Slow, deliberate. Then another. Lisa's voice called out from within the house. Soft, sweet, inviting. "It's okay now. You can come inside." Rachel sobbed harder. Wes grabbed Noah's arm. His voice was barely a breath. "That's not Lisa." Noah nodded, his mouth dry, his mind racing. And then, the thing wearing Lisa's skin stepped into the doorway. It looked like her, but it wasn't her. The shape was the same. The clothes, the hair. But the eyes, black, hollow, as if the thing inside her had emptied her out, leaving just a puppet. She smiled, a slow, too wide grin, stretching her lips too far. Lisa tilted her head, her bones cracking with the movement. Her voice came again, too soft, too gentle. "Come inside." No one moved. The thing in Lisa's skin blinked, and when it opened its eyes again, There were no eyes left at all, just darkness. It stepped forward. Rachel let out a broken gasp. Wes grabbed Noah's wrist, his fingers like iron. We have to go now. But the trees had changed. The path that had led them back to the cabin was gone. The trees had closed in, shifting, twisting, curling into each other, like a maze that had sealed itself shut. There was no way out, and Lisa was coming. The whispering returned, filling the night, swelling, screaming inside their skulls. You see it now. You see it now. Noah backed up, dragging Rachel to her feet, his pulse hammering. Lisa took another step forward, then another. She wasn't running. She didn't have to, because there was nowhere left to run. Wes was shaking. We have to. We have to. And then, Lisa stopped. She turned her head, her mouth curling at the corners. And from behind her, from inside the cabin, another voice spoke. Noah's stomach dropped, because it was his voice. It's okay now. You can come inside. Rachel's scream tore through the night. Lisa moved faster than she should have been able to, her arms snapping outward, her fingers stretching too long, reaching for them. Noah shoved Rachel away, throwing himself backward as Lisa's hand grazed his wrist, and everything went black. Noah woke up in the cabin. The air was thick, damp, pressing against his skin like something alive. The whispering was gone. The house was silent. His head pounded. His limbs felt heavy, like they didn't belong to him. And then, a voice. Rachel. Noah. He turned his head. Rachel was sitting on the floor beside him, knees pulled to her chest, her eyes red from crying. Wes was sitting across from her. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. They were inside the cabin. Noah pushed himself upright, his pulse hammering. What happened? Where's my God? And then he saw her. Lisa, sitting in the corner. Her head was tilted downward, her hands folded in her lap, perfectly still, not moving, not breathing. Rachel shook her head. She's been like that since we woke up. Noah's heart raced. He took a slow step forward. Lisa, no response. She didn't even flinch. She just sat there, her body too still, like a marionette waiting for its strings to be pulled. Wes's voice was hoarse. She's not moving. Noah swallowed, his throat dry. Something was wrong. Rachel whispered, I think we never left. Noah's pulse stopped. His breath came short, sharp, because the walls of the cabin, they were different now. Darker, wrong, like the wood had rotted overnight, the grain curling in ways it shouldn't. The furniture was older, covered in dust, like they had been here for a long time, like they had never left at all. Lisa's head snapped up. Rachel let out a small, sharp gasp. Lisa's eyes were gone, just empty, black hollows, staring at them. Her mouth opened, and then she spoke. But it wasn't her voice anymore. It was all of them. You see it now. Noah's blood ran cold. Lisa smiled, and the whispering returned. You see it now. You see it now. You see it now. And then, the cabin door slammed shut. Lisa's smile stretched too wide. Her empty eye sockets locked onto Noah. The whispering was back, growing louder, filling every corner of the cabin. Noah backed up, his pulse hammering. Rachel was frozen in place, her breath coming in short gasps, while Wes clenched his fists, his whole body tense. Lisa stood up. No one moved. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, suffocating them with an unnatural weight. Then she spoke. You see it now. Her voice was layered, not one voice, but many, overlapping, speaking through her like she was nothing more than a shell. Noah grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her back. We need to get out of here. Lisa tilted her head, stepping closer. There is no out. The whispering swelled. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched, writhing, growing taller. The walls were changing, warping, the wood splitting apart like something was trying to break through. Noah reached for the door. It wouldn't budge. Rachel yanked on the handle with him, sobbing. It won't open. Wes turned to the windows. He grabbed a chair, throwing it at the glass with all his strength. But instead of shattering, the glass rippled, like it was made of water. Wes staggered back. What the hell? Lisa took another step forward. The whispering became deafening. Noah grabbed a fire poker from the fireplace and turned to her. "What did you do to Lisa?" She laughed. Rachel whimpered. Wes clenched his jaw. Lisa's body twitched unnaturally, her head jerking to the side. Then she took another step, her bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. Noah didn't wait. He swung the fire poker at her. The second it hit, Lisa vanished. The air snapped silent. The room was empty. Rachel gasped, looking around. Where did she go? Noah turned in a circle, his heart racing. "She was just," a voice whispered against his ear. "Behind you." He spun around. Lisa was inches from his face, her hollow eyes staring directly into his. She reached for him. Everything went dark. Noah woke up in the woods. The air was thick and humid, the scent of damp earth filling his lungs. The trees were towering over him, stretching impossibly high, their branches tangled like veins against the night sky. Rachel and Wes were nearby, just as confused, their eyes wide with fear. The cabin was gone. Noah pushed himself to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Where are we?" Rachel wiped her face, shaking. "I don't know." Wes scanned the trees. "This isn't right. The road should be here. The cabin should be here." Noah turned slowly. The forest around them was wrong. The trees weren't normal. Their bark twisted in unnatural patterns, their trunks warped, curving where they shouldn't. And the deeper he looked into the woods, the more he saw shapes standing between the trees, watching. Rachel grabbed Noah's arm, pointing. "Do you see that?" Noah followed her gaze. Something was moving between the trees. Not one thing, many things, tall, thin figures, shifting in the shadows. Wiz took a step back. "We need to move." Noah nodded.
Where?
No one had an answer. They started walking, moving carefully through the trees. The figures didn't move at first, just standing, watching. Then one of them took a step. Then another. Rachel whimpered. "They're following us." Noah walked faster. The whispering was back, slithering through the trees, curling around them. "You see it now. You see it now." The voices were closer, overlapping, growing louder. Wes grabbed Noah's arm. "Run." They did. They sprinted through the woods, branches slashing at their arms and faces, their breath ragged. The trees blurred past them, the ground uneven beneath their feet. Noah risked a glance behind. The figures were closer, moving too fast. The whispering had become a chorus, rising into something almost like a chant. "You see it now. You see it now. You see it now. You see it now." The forest opened up, a clearing, and in the center, the cabin. Rachel choked on a sob. No, we left. We left." Noah's legs nearly gave out. Wes was shaking his head. It wasn't possible. They had run away from it. And yet, here it was, standing, waiting. The door was open. Lisa's voice came from inside, soft, gentle. "Come inside." Noah turned to run. The figures had surrounded them. Rachel screamed. Wes swore. The whispering crashed over them like a wave. Lisa stepped into the doorway, her smile stretching too wide. And then she said something new, something they hadn't heard before. "You were never meant to leave." The figures stepped forward. The trees pressed closer. The cabin door swung open wider. Rachel sobbed, covering her ears. "Please make it stop." Noah turned in a circle, searching for anything, any way out. There was none. The forest was gone. The world was gone. There was only the cabin. Lisa tilted her head. "Come home." Noah's body moved on its own. His legs walked toward the door, even as his mind screamed at him to stop. Rachel and Wes were moving too, their eyes wide with horror, their bodies betraying them. They couldn't stop. Lisa smiled wider. "You were always meant to stay." Noah stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind them. Darkness swallowed everything whole, and the whispering finally stopped. The door slammed shut, sealing them in. The silence was absolute. Noah stood frozen, his breath shallow, his muscles locked in place. Rachel and Wes were beside him, their bodies rigid, their eyes wide with horror. The cabin felt different now. The walls weren't just wood anymore. They pulsed. The ceiling breezed. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against them like invisible hands, pushing them deeper inside. Lisa stood near the fireplace, or rather the thing wearing Lisa's skin. Her grin was stretched too wide, her head tilted slightly, as if studying them. "You're home now," Rachel whimpered. Noah clenched his fists. "Let us go." Lisa's face didn't change. Her voice was calm, too calm. "There is no leaving." Noah took a step back, his heart hammering. The walls groaned, shifting like the entire cabin was alive. The floor beneath them lurched slightly, just enough to make them stumble. Wes's breathing was fast and shallow. What is this place?" Lisa blinked slowly. "This is where you belong." Rachel shook her head violently, backing up toward the door. No, we don't. We don't belong here." Lisa tilted her head the other way. Then, without moving her lips, the whispering returned. "You see it now. You see it now." The sound came from inside their own heads. Rachel clamped her hands over her ears. "Stop it. Stop it." Noah grabbed her arm. "Stay with me." Lisa took a step forward. "You were never meant to leave." Wes lunged for the door handle, twisting it hard. It wouldn't move. He slammed his shoulder against it. Come on. The door didn't budge. Lisa took another step forward. Noah grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and pointed it at her. "Stay back." She just smiled. Then all the doors in the house slammed open at once. A rush of cold air howled through the cabin, snuffing out the candles, plunging them into near darkness. The only light came from the fireplace, flickering weakly, barely illuminating Lisa's grinning face. Then came the footsteps. Not Lisa's, from above them. Heavy, deliberate, slow. Noah's stomach turned to ice. There was something upstairs. Lisa's eyes flicked toward the ceiling. Her grin stretched even wider. "It's awake," Rachel sobbed. Wes pounded on the door. The footsteps grew louder, coming toward the staircase. Noah could hear the wood groaning under the weight of whatever it was. His breath came in ragged gasps. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. "You should go see it." Noah's body moved on its own. His legs started walking toward the stairs. "Noah!" Rachel grabbed his arm, yanking him back. Noah gasped, breaking free from whatever force had pulled him. He stumbled backward, shaking. The footsteps paused. Then, a deep wet breath, like something huge inhaling just above them. Noah slowly looked up, and for the first time, he saw it. At the top of the stairs, something leaned forward. It was tall, its body stretching unnaturally, its head tilted too far to the side. Its eyes were just dark holes, staring directly at him. Noah couldn't breathe. Rachel was whispering prayers, her hands clutched together, tears streaking down her face. Wes had gone completely still. The thing at the top of the stairs moved. It didn't walk, it glided, its limbs bending unnaturally. As it descended, step by step, step. Lisa stepped aside, grinning. "It's time." Noah finally moved. He grabbed Rachel and Wes and ran for the kitchen. They crashed through the doorway, slamming the door behind them. Rachel was hyperventilating, gripping Noah's sleeve. Wes locked the door, his face pale. What the hell was that? Noah's hands were shaking. I don't know. The whispering had stopped again. The house was silent. Then knock. Rachel flinched. Another knock. Slow, heavy. The sound came from the other side of the door. The thing was right outside. Rachel muffled a sob. Wes clenched his fists. Noah didn't move. Then, a voice. Lisa's voice. "Noah, open the door." His throat closed. Rachel shook her head violently, gripping his arm. "That's not her." Wes's hands trembled. "Noah, let us in." The door handle twisted slightly. Rachel covered her mouth, her body shaking. Then came a new sound. A low scraping. The thing was dragging its fingers down the door. Lisa's voice came again. "We're waiting." Rachel lost it. She grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, pointing it at the door. "Stay away from us." Silence. No more scraping. No more whispering. Noah didn't move. Then the cabin shifted. Not just the floor, not just the walls. The entire house groaned, like it had just breathed in. Noah's stomach turned. Wes stepped back. Did the house just move? No one answered. Getting in the door to the basement creaked open. Rachel whimpered. No, no, no. Wes backed away. Don't look. Noah turned anyway. The basement door was wide open. Nothing but pitch black darkness beyond the threshold. Then, a hand reached out. Long. Too long. Fingers stretching unnaturally, dragging against the floorboards. And then, it pulled itself forward. Noah shoved Rachel toward the back door. Go. Wes slammed his shoulder against the door. It wouldn't open. The thing in the basement crawled forward, pulling itself up. Its body too thin, its limbs bending at wrong angles. Rachel was screaming. Wes was kicking the door. Noah grabbed a chair and threw it at the window. And this time, the glass shattered. Cold air rushed in. Rachel was the first through. Wes followed. Noah turned back just in time to see the thing from the basement stand up to its full height. It opened its mouth, and for the first time it spoke. You were always meant to stay. Noah jumped through the window, and the last thing he heard before hitting the ground was the sound of the house breathing. Noah hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, but he didn't have time to recover. The cabin was behind them. The thing from the basement was coming. Rachel grabbed his arm, yanking him to his feet. Wes was already running, his breath ragged, his hands clenched into fists. Move, move now. Noah didn't hesitate. They sprinted into the woods, branches whipping against their faces, their feet pounding against the damp earth. The night was thick, pressing in around them like a living thing. The whispering was everywhere. You see it now. You see it now. You were always meant to stay. Noah didn't look back. Rachel sobbed as she ran, her voice hoarse. Where do we go? Where do we go? Wes's voice was tight. Anywhere but here. Noah's lungs burned. His legs felt like they would give out at any moment. But he pushed forward. The trees blurred around them, shadows twisting in his peripheral vision. And then the forest shifted. One moment, they were running straight. The next, the trees were in a different place. The path they had been following was gone. Rachel stumbled, nearly falling. No, no, this isn't right. We were going straight. Was slowed, turning in a frantic circle. It's changing. The woods are changing. Noah grabbed Rachel's wrist, trying to pull her forward. We have to keep moving. The whispering grew louder. Then, a crackling laugh echoed through the trees. Not Lisa's voice, not the thing from the basement. Something else, something bigger. Rachel's breath hitched. That's not Lisa. Noah's stomach dropped. It was coming from above them. He lifted his gaze. Something was hanging in the trees. Tall, long-limbed, twisting unnaturally. Watching. The branches creaked as it shifted. The whispering turned into words, clear and sharp. You were never supposed to leave. Noah grabbed Wes and Rachel, yanking them in the opposite direction. Run. They bolted. The thing moved above them, its body gliding through the treetops without effort. The trees blurred again. Rachel sobbed. It's not letting us leave. Wes growled, pushing forward. We have to keep going. It can't be endless. Noah wasn't sure about that anymore. They ran. They kept running. And then, they saw lights. A road. An actual road. Rachel gasped. We made it. The cabin was on the other side. Noah stopped dead. Rachel nearly collapsed. Wes let out a broken laugh. No, 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 no. It wasn't possible. They had run in a straight line. And yet, they were back where they started. The cabin's front door stood open. Lisa was standing there waiting, her empty eyes locked on them. Rachel was shaking violently. We can't go back. We can't. Elisa smiled. And for the first time, she stepped off the porch. Her body twisted as she moved, like her bones weren't meant for walking. Noah turned to Wes. We have to fight. Wes's jaw clenched. How? Rachel collapsed. We can't fight that. Lisa kept walking. You were always meant to stay. Noah's hands tightened into fists. Not if I can help it. Lisa moved faster. The thing in the trees laughed again. The whispering reached a fever pitch. You see it now. You see it now. Noah grabbed a rock from the ground. It was stupid. It was desperate. but he threw it at Lisa with everything he had. It hit her square in the chest. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she grinned wider, and then she opened her mouth, far too wide. Her jaw unhinged, stretching longer than any human should. A deep guttural sound rumbled from inside her, and the cabin door slammed shut behind her. The forest went still. Lisa didn't move. Rachel whimpered, pulling herself upright. Noah took a slow step back. What just? The cabin door creaked open again. Lisa turned. Her grin was gone, and for the first time she looked afraid. Noah didn't understand, until he saw the thing standing in the doorway. It wasn't Lisa. It wasn't human. It was the real thing, the thing that owned this place. The whispering stopped altogether. The world held its breath. Then, it stepped out of the cabin. Rachel screamed. Noah grabbed Wes and ran. Lisa turned to flee, but it was too late. The thing grabbed her. Her body convulsed. She let out a sound, something between a scream and static. Then she wasn't Lisa anymore. Her body collapsed inward, folding in on itself. The thing consumed her. And then, it looked at them. Rachel was crying. No, no please. It moved toward them. Noah didn't stop to think. He ran for the road. Wes was right behind him, dragging Rachel along. The thing didn't chase them. It didn't have to. The road started to change again. The trees warped. The stars blinked out. The whispering returned. You see it now. Noah kept running. He could feel something closing in, the weight of it pressing against his skull, his lungs burning. And then, the road split apart. A sheer drop opened ahead of them. A cliff. A void. There was nowhere left to run. Rachel turned, her voice hollow. What do we do? Noah's mind raced. The thing was coming toward them. He looked at the drop, then back at the thing, just clenched his jaw. We jump, Rachel sobbed. No, we don't have a choice. The thing stepped closer. Noah grabbed Rachel's hand, and then, they jumped. The last thing Noah saw before the darkness swallowed them was the thing standing at the edge, looking down, smiling, and then, nothing. Noah hit nothing. For a moment it felt like falling through empty space, like the world had disappeared around them. No sound, no air, just a vast consuming void. Rachel's scream cut through the silence. Wes cursed, his voice distorted as they plummeted. Then, impact. Noah hit solid ground. Not water, not air, ground. His lungs seized as pain exploded through his body. He rolled onto his side, coughing, gasping for breath. Rachel landed next to him with a broken cry, clutching her ribs. Wes hit the ground a second later, his body going limp on impact. Silence settled around them. Noah forced himself onto his elbows, eyes widening. They weren't in the forest anymore. They weren't anywhere they recognized. The ground beneath them was smooth, dark stone, not cold, not warm, just there. The air felt thick, too heavy to be real, pressing against them from all sides. The sky was black, but not like nighttime. It was wrong, a vast endless void stretching overhead, like the world had simply stopped existing above them. There were no stars, no wind, just silence. Rachel whimpered, curling in on herself. Where are we? Noah didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. Wes groaned, pushing himself up. That didn't feel like falling. Noah swallowed, shaking his head. Noah didn't. Rachel's breath hitched. We didn't hit the ground. Not really. No one spoke. Then, a sound, a low scraping, coming from behind them. Noah turned slowly. The cliff they had jumped from was gone. Nothing but endless darkness stretched behind them. A horizon that didn't exist. And in the distance, a figure, watching, standing too still, too far away to see clearly. But Noah felt it stare. Rachel grabbed his arm. Noah, I think we made it worse. Wes's breathing was unsteady. We have to move. Rachel was shaking her head, tears streaking down her face. Move where? There's nowhere to go. Noah took a slow step forward. The ground didn't shift, didn't even feel real beneath his feet. But it let him walk. The figure in the distance didn't follow. Not yet. They moved carefully. stepping across the strange stone, listening to the sound of their own breaths in the emptiness. Then, after what felt like hours, Noah saw something ahead. A door, standing alone. Nothing around it. No walls. No structure. Just a single wooden door, identical to the one at the cabin. Rachel exhaled sharply. That's not possible. Wes clenched his jaw. Nothing about this is possible. Noah stepped closer. The door was old. Its handle rusted. Its wood warped as if it had been sitting in this place for far longer than it should have existed. Rachel hesitated. What if it takes us somewhere worse? Noah didn't know what to say, because he knew it would, but the figure was closer now. No footsteps, no sound. It had simply moved forward. And this time, Noah could see it better. It was not human, not a creature, not something he could put into words. It was a space in reality that shouldn't exist. A tear in the fabric of the world, shaped like a man, its edges flickering in and out, its form bending, breaking, shifting, and it was coming for them. Noah grabbed the handle of the door and threw it open. Behind it was light, too bright, too overwhelming. But they had no choice. Rachel grabbed his arm. Noah, wait. He pulled her through. Wes followed, and then the door slammed shut behind them. Noah hit solid ground, real ground, grass, dirt. The scent of rain-soaked earth filled his lungs. His eyes snapped open. They were in the forest, the real forest. The stars were above them. The wind moved the leaves. The air felt real again. Rachel gasped, sitting up, touching her arms, her face. Oh my God. Wes was on his knees, hands in his hair, whispering, "We're back. We're back." Noah stared at the trees around them, his breath unsteady. The cabin was gone. No broken road, no warped trees, no whispering. They were really out. Rachel choked on a laugh, covering her mouth. "We did it." Noah exhaled. "Yeah." Wes let out a weak laugh. "I don't even care where we are. I just want to go home." Rachel nodded quickly. Yes, please. Let's go. I don't care if we have to walk for hours. Let's just go." Noah took one last look around. The trees felt normal again. Everything was quiet, but not unnatural silence, just the kind of stillness that belonged to the woods at night. They started walking. Noah didn't look back, because he didn't want to see if something was watching. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, the whispering was gone. Noah, Rachel and Wes walked in silence. The dirt was solid beneath their feet, the night air cool against their skin. Every breath they took felt too fragile, like the reality around them could collapse at any second. They were out. At least, they thought they were. The forest stretched endlessly ahead, and none of them knew exactly where they were. The road should have been somewhere nearby, but the only thing they could do was keep moving. Rachel's voice was hoarse. "How long have we been walking?" Noah shook his head. "No idea." Wes glanced behind them, his shoulders tense. "You think we should rest?" Noah's stomach twisted. Resting felt wrong, as if the moment they stopped, something would catch up to them. Rachel let out a shuddering breath. "I don't ever want to stop." They pressed on. The deeper they walked into the forest, the more normal it seemed. The trees weren't warped anymore. The shadows weren't stretching. The world felt real again. Then, lights. Up ahead. Rachel gasped. "Is that the—" Noah's heart leaped into his throat. A road, streetlights, and beyond it, the faint glow of a town in the distance. Wes let out a broken laugh. "We did it. We actually did." Then he stopped. Noah's breath caught, because just beyond the trees, standing at the edge of the road, was a figure, a woman. Rachel's voice shook. "Is that the Lisa?" She stood there, completely still, her face blank, her eyes dark, the same Lisa they had known, but also not at dawn. Noah's pulse pounded. "That's not her." Lisa blinked slowly. Then she smiled. The whispering returned, soft, gentle. "You were always meant to stay." Rachel whimpered. Wes grabbed Noah's arm. Lisa's lips moved, but the whispering wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the woods behind them. Rachel sobbed. "No, please, no." Lisa tilted her head. "You should come home." Noah stepped back. Lisa's smile didn't change. She lifted her hand and pointed to the trees. The woods darkened. Something moved within the trees. Noah didn't wait. He grabbed Rachel and Wes and ran straight toward the road. Lisa didn't move. She just watched. They reached the asphalt, their feet slamming against the pavement. The road was real. The streetlights were real. They didn't stop running. Rachel was crying. Wes was panting. And Noah didn't dare look behind them. Finally, the town came into view. Buildings, street signs, cars, a gas station up ahead. The neon lights blazing against the dark. A man stood outside, leaning against his car. Noah ran straight for him. "Help us, please." The man turned, his face scrunching in confusion. "Whoa, what happened to you guys?" Rachel gasped for breath. We need Ben." She froze. Noah turned back toward the woods. Lisa was gone, and the forest was still. No warped trees, no shadows stretching, no whispering, just a normal forest, like nothing had ever happened. Rachel sobbed. Wes ran his hands down his face. The man at the gas station frowned. "You kids lost or something?" Noah couldn't answer. His throat was too tight. They were back, but that didn't mean they were safe, because as he turned toward the town, heart still hammering, a single voice whispered in the back of his mind, "Not yet." The wind carried the scent of damp earth through the graveyard, weaving between the crooked headstones like unseen fingers, tracing the names of the forgotten. The rain had started just past midnight, a soft drizzle that clung to the air and turned the narrow paths into slick, winding trails of mud. The only sound was the distant hoot of an owl, muffled beneath the steady patter of water on leaves, stone, and the skeletal branches of trees, standing like silent sentinels among the graves. A lone figure moved cautiously through the cemetery, the beam of his flashlight cutting weakly through the mist. His name was Daniel, and he was here on a dare. It was supposed to be a joke, a drunken bet between friends at a bar, just outside town. Stay in the graveyard until dawn. Alone, no phone, no way to contact the outside world. Just him, the dead, and whatever shadows lurked between them. At first he had laughed it off, but the money on the table was enough to make him reconsider. Besides, it was just a cemetery, right? The gate had groaned on its rusted hinges. When he pushed it open, the sound swallowed quickly by the night. Now standing among the tombstones, he felt the weight of the place pressing against his chest. He tried to shake off the unease, telling himself it was just his imagination, but something about the air here felt thick, heavy, as though time moved differently beyond these gates. A gust of wind stirred the branches overhead, sending a scattering of rain onto his jacket. He pulled it tighter around himself and pressed on, following the winding path deeper into the cemetery. The flashlight flickered briefly, making his heart skip a beat, but it held steady. His boots made soft squelching sounds in the mud, and he tried not to think about how much darker it seemed the farther he walked. It wasn't supposed to be this big. He had driven past the cemetery before, and from the road, it looked like little more than a few dozen graves tucked behind an iron fence. But from within, it stretched endlessly, the mist obscuring any sign of where it ended. He paused near an old mausoleum, its stone facade weathered with age, the name carved above the door, worn away by time. There was a strange quiet here, not just an absence of sound, but something deeper, like the world beyond the graveyard had been stripped away. The silence pressed against his ears, making him hyper-aware of every breath, every shift of his clothing, every small movement in the shadows around him. He turned away from the mausoleum and kept walking, pushing the creeping dread aside. The rain grew heavier, dripping down the back of his neck. He wiped a hand across his face and sighed, cursing himself for agreeing to this. Then, just as he was about to turn back toward the entrance, something shifted at the edge of his vision. A shadow moved between the headstones. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. He swung the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing there, just rows of old graves, and the mist swirling between them. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Probably just a trick of the rain, or maybe an animal. He kept walking. The deeper he went, the more distorted the graveyard seemed. The stones leaned at odd angles, names half erased by time. Some graves looked ancient, their surfaces covered in lichen and moss, while others seemed fresh, the dirt still loose and unsettled. He didn't remember seeing this part before. Had he taken a wrong turn? A faint whisper drifted through the mist. Daniel stopped again, holding his breath. It was distant, indistinct, but it was there. A voice, low and rasping, carried on the wind. His grip tightened on the flashlight. As he swept it around, searching for the source, nothing. He took a cautious step forward, then another. The air felt colder now, the dampness sinking deep into his bones. His breath came out in small, visible puffs, though it wasn't nearly cold enough for that. Another whisper, closer this time. His heart hammered against his ribs. He turned sharply, the flashlight's beam cutting through the mist just in time to catch a flicker of movement between the graves. Something darted behind a large, crumbling tombstone. His first instinct was to call out, but his throat tightened before the words could come. No, he didn't want to know. He took a step back, then another, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone he was. The mist thickened around him, swallowing the trees, the mausoleums, even the headstones just a few feet away. He could barely see beyond his own outstretched hand. And then the whispering stopped. The silence was worse. A deep, suffocating stillness settled over the graveyard. No wind, no rain, nothing. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. Then something breathed behind him. He spun, the flashlight slipping in his grip. A figure stood between the graves, barely visible through the fog. Tall, gaunt, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. His stomach lurched. It was wrong, so wrong, something that shouldn't exist. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose stone. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting up his wrist as he scrambled to right himself. The flashlight rolled away, its beam cutting a jagged line across the grave markers. The figure didn't move. Daniel's chest heaved. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Then it stepped forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, the mist curling around its form like smoke. Daniel forced himself to his feet, grabbing the flashlight with trembling fingers. The beam flickered, the battery struggling against the damp. He turned and ran, his boots slipping in the mud, breath ragged as he stumbled between the graves. Behind him, the whispering returned. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was many. The air pressed against his ears, the weight of the unseen voices growing heavier with every step. The entrance, he just had to reach the entrance. But when he looked up, the path was gone. Only graves, only darkness, and the whispering growing louder. The whispering surrounded him, seeping into his bones, filling the spaces between his breaths. It wasn't like words spoken in any language he knew. It was deeper, older, something that scraped against his mind like fingernails against stone. It wove through the mist, curling around him, sinking into his skin, like the damp cold that clung to his clothes. Daniel turned in frantic circles, his flashlight beam slicing through the thick fog, revealing nothing but rows of headstones stretching into the darkness. The entrance was gone, swallowed by the night. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, the cold air burning his lungs. He was lost. No, not lost. Trapped. The whispering was closer now, more distinct. It wasn't just voices. It was breathing, wet, ragged inhales, followed by slow, shuddering exhales. The air smelled different too, heavy with something metallic, something rotten. He staggered back, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The graves around him seemed to move, the fog shifting like something was crawling beneath it. He wasn't alone. A low, almost imperceptible scraping sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness, like fingernails dragging across stone. His flashlight flickered again, the weak beam sputtering as if the battery was being drained by the very air around him. Then something moved, a shape, just beyond the mist. Daniel's muscles tensed, his grip on the flashlight tightening until his knuckles turned white. He forced himself to stay still, listening, waiting. Another breath closer, then a whisper, just beside his ear. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel lunged forward, panic taking hold. sprinting blindly between the gravestones. His feet slipped in the mud, the mist thickening like a living thing, curling around his legs, pulling him down. He barely caught himself on a broken tombstone, his hand scraping against the jagged surface. The coldness of the stone felt unnatural, almost like flesh. He didn't stop to think about it. He pushed himself forward, half running, half stumbling through the graveyard, his pulse pounding in his ears. The whispering followed him, no longer distant, no longer just a presence at the edge of his senses. It was all around him. The graves stretched endlessly. No matter which way he turned, they stood in neat, endless rows, fading into the mist. The path should have been here. He was sure of it. But the more he ran, the more everything shifted. The graves rearranging themselves, the mausoleums turning their faceless, nameless walls toward him, like silent watchers. He wasn't just lost. The graveyard was changing. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the night. Not a whisper this time, not a breath, something else. A low, shuddering growl, thick with something inhuman. Daniel froze. The flashlight beam trembled in his shaking hands, barely illuminating the fog-drenched ground ahead of him. He turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat. Between the gravestones, the shadows twisted. Something was there. It didn't move like a person. It didn't move like anything he had ever seen before. Its limbs were too long, its body half draped in the mist, like it was part of it. The flashlight barely caught its features, but what it did reveal was wrong. A face stretched too thin, skin hanging like a rotted shroud over bones that jutted out at impossible angles. Its eyes were nothing but deep black voids. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It just watched. Daniel took a step back, his foot crunching against loose gravel. The sound echoed louder than it should have, cutting through the whispering. The thing reacted. Its head jerked in his direction, its mouth opening in a slow, deliberate motion. No teeth, no tongue, just a gaping black hole, endless and hungry. And then it moved. Not walking, not running, sliding. Daniel's body jolted into action before his mind could catch up. He turned and ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly, shadows leaping and twisting in every direction. The whispering turned to laughter, dry and hollow, threading through the mist like it was coming from the graves themselves. He didn't dare look back. His lungs burned. His legs screamed in protest as he sprinted through the maze of tombstones, searching for anything. A way out, a sign, a wall, the goddamn gate. The mist swirled, thickening, suffocating. And then, he saw it. A light, flickering, pale in the distance. Hope surged through him like adrenaline, pushing him forward. He ran toward it, ignoring the way the shadows seemed to crawl along the ground behind him. The way the laughter grew more distorted, more wrong. The light grew closer. A lantern, a house, a way out. And then, it was gone. The moment his feet touched the ground where it had been, everything shifted. The air turned cold, the whispering stopped, and the graveyard breathed. Daniel staggered, nearly falling as the mist parted before him, revealing something new, something that hadn't been there before. A grave, fresh, the dirt still loose, damp from the rain, and the name carved into the headstone. Daniel Carter. His breath caught in his throat. His vision swam. No, 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 no. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. Something moved behind him. Slow, methodical, close. He turned, his flashlight beam flickering as it landed on a figure, standing just at the edge of the mist. Tall, thin, the same black hollow eyes, the same open gaping mouth. But this time it spoke. It's time. The last thing Daniel felt was the ground giving way beneath him, pulling him down, 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 into the grave that bore his name. The earth swallowed him whole. Daniel's scream never left his throat. As he plunged into the damp soil, the weight of the grave pulling him down in a slow, suffocating descent. The dirt closed around his limbs, thick and unrelenting, seeping into his mouth, pressing against his ribs, his heartbeat hammering like a trapped animal. His flashlight flickered wildly in his grip, its weak beam cutting through the darkness, for just a moment before it was snuffed out. The cold surrounded him, deeper than the rain, deeper than anything he had ever felt. It wasn't just the cold of the ground, it was the cold of something else, something older than the cemetery, something waiting beneath the graves. The whispering returned, not from above, not from the mist or the headstones. From below, Daniel's fingers clawed at the dirt, his nails ripping against the damp soil, as he struggled to pull himself up. But the more he fought, the deeper he sank. The ground wasn't just swallowing him, it was pulling him. Hands, thin, grasping fingers brushed against his ankles, his wrists, his neck. They were there, and then gone, as though the earth itself was alive, shifting, twisting around him. His breath hitched in his throat. No, no, this isn't real. This isn't real. A voice answered from the darkness. It's real. Daniel's body stiffened. The voice didn't come from above. It came from inside the earth, from somewhere just beyond the veil of dirt, pressing against his ears. It was deep, distorted, layered, like many voices speaking at once. Then the ground gave way. Daniel fell. He didn't hit the bottom. There was no impact, no end to his descent, just the sensation of falling. The grave stretching downward into nothingness, the damp, rotted air thickening around him. The darkness had depth here. It moved, it breathed, it whispered in 1,000 voices that scraped against his mind. And then, silence. Daniel's body stopped, but he didn't land. He simply existed, suspended in the void, weightless. The air around him wasn't air at all. It was thick, heavy, pressing against his skin like a second layer of flesh. His fleshlight was gone. His voice was gone. Then, something stirred. The darkness ahead of him shifted, slow and deliberate, as though something massive had been waiting just beyond his sight. It uncoiled, unfolding in the shadows, something vast and hungry. Daniel could feel it, watching, waiting, smiling. A deep, shuddering breath rattled through the void, not his. Then the whispering returned, but this time, it spoke directly to him. You do not belong here. The weight of the words pressed against his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. He tried to move, tried to breathe, but the pressure only increased. The thing in the darkness moved closer. He still couldn't see it, not entirely, but he could feel it. Its shape was wrong, its presence too vast, stretching beyond sight, beyond understanding. It didn't walk toward him. It emerged. The shadows peeled away, revealing something tall and impossible. Its form was human, almost. The body was wrapped in tattered, decayed cloth, woven from the grave itself. Its arms were too long, its fingers dragging the void as it reached for him. And its face, no, it didn't have a face. It had a hole, a gaping, endless void where its mouth should have been, swallowing the darkness, devouring the air itself. Daniel tried to scream, but the sound never came. Then it spoke again, this time inside his head. You are already dead. The words struck him like a physical force, cracking through his skull, twisting into his mind. No, that's not true. He wasn't dead. He was alive. The thing took another step closer, the darkness shifting around it, clinging to it like a second skin. You were never alive. Daniel clutched his head, the pain unbearable. Images flashed through his mind, flickering like an old broken film reel. His body standing at the cemetery gates, his breath visible in the cold air, his reflection missing from the rain-slicked headstones. The bet, the dare, the moment he stepped into the graveyard. Had he ever left? Had he ever been real at all? His thoughts unraveled, memories breaking apart like shattered glass, falling into the abyss around him. The thing in the dark reached forward, its long fingers brushing against his forehead. The touch was freezing, not just cold, but empty, a void where warmth should have been. And then, he remembered, the truth came rushing back, a flood of whispers clawing through his mind. He had been here before, not just tonight, many times. Each time he had walked into the graveyard, each time he had become lost, and each time he had died, over and over and over. Daniel's breath hitched. The thing in the dark tilted its head, watching him, waiting. It wanted him to remember, to accept it, to understand that there was no escape. Daniel looked down at his hands, watching as his fingers began to fade, turning to mist, dissolving into the shadows that swirled around him. No, he whispered. No, I won't. The thing stepped closer, The void in its face opened wider, and then, it spoke one last time. "You always do." The darkness rushed forward, and Daniel forgot. Daniel awoke with a gasp. His lungs burned as if he had been drowning, his body rigid with cold, his fingers digging into damp earth. The rain pattered gently against his skin, the scent of wet grass and stone filling his nostrils. His breath came in short, frantic gulps, his mind struggling to piece together where he was, why he was lying on the ground, why his entire body ached, as if he had been pulled from somewhere he didn't belong. The graveyard stretched around him in eerie silence, the mist curling lazily between the headstones. His flashlight lay beside him, its weak beam flickering like a dying firefly. Had he blacked out? He sat up slowly, his fingers sinking into the soft, freshly disturbed dirt beneath him. A sense of unease crawled up his spine. As he looked down, the grave beneath him was open, not fully dug, not a deep pit, but open, the soil uneven, as if something had emerged from it. Panic rose in his throat as he scrambled to his feet, backing away from the grave. His mind felt sluggish, pieces of the past hour slipping between his thoughts, like sand through his fingers. He had been running from something in the mist, something that whispered in voices that weren't human, something wrong. His fingers brushed over his own face, cold and clammy. His pulse thrummed wildly against his ribs. As he turned, searching for the cemetery gates, for any sign of the road, for a way out. But the graveyard was different. The paths were unfamiliar, the trees looming taller, the mausoleums standing like silent sentinels in places where he swore they hadn't been before. The mist moved differently now, as if alive, curling around the gravestones in deliberate patterns, shifting in ways that made his stomach lurch. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was worse. Daniel's fingers tightened around the flashlight, its dim glow barely cutting through the fog. He needed to go, now. Whatever had happened, whatever nightmare he had fallen into, he had to find a way out before. A footstep, soft, wet, just behind him. Daniel's breath hitched in his throat, his muscles locked, his body frozen in place. He turned, nothing, just the graveyard, the headstones, the empty space between them. And yet, he wasn't alone. Something had moved. He was sure of it. The air felt different, thick with the weight of presence. He swallowed hard, taking a cautious step backward. His boots squelched against the damp ground, and he winced at the sound. The flashlight flickered again. He smacked it against his palm, desperate to keep the light steady. And then, a whisper, low, breathless, "Close, you came back." Daniel's stomach twisted violently. The voice hadn't come from behind him, it had come from the grave. His gaze snapped downward, his breath catching in his throat. The soil at his feet shifted, something beneath the dirt moved. Slowly, carefully, deliberately, Daniel stumbled back, his chest tightening with raw terror. The whispering grew louder, pressing against his ears like a swarm of unseen mouths, speaking in his voice now, repeating his own words back at him. "This isn't real. This isn't happening. This isn't real." The dirt split. A hand, thin, skeletal, coated in the damp blackness of the grave, reached out. Daniel turned and ran. His breath tore from his lungs in ragged, panicked bursts, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted through the mist, dodging gravestones, slipping on the slick earth beneath him. The whispering chased him, his own voice mocking him, twisting, distorting. "You always do. You always do. You always do." His legs ached, his body screaming for rest. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Not until he found the gate, not until he was out. The whispering twisted into laughter, dry, hollow, familiar. Daniel's foot caught on something, a root, a stone, and he went down hard, crashing into the mud, his palms scraping against jagged gravel. The flashlight tumbled from his grip, rolling a few feet away. He groaned, pain lancing up his leg, and reached for the flashlight. A foot stepped into the beam of light, bare, gray, the toes longer than they should be, the nails blackened with something thick. Daniel's breath locked in his throat. Slowly, too slowly, he lifted his gaze. The figure loomed over him, wrapped in the same mist that had swallowed the graveyard. Its body twisted, its arms too long, its fingers dragging the earth. But the worst part, the face. It was his, pale, sunken, lifeless. The thing wearing his face tilted its head, watching him with hollow black eyes. Then its mouth. His mouth, split open wider than humanly possible, stretching into an endless void. And it spoke, "You never leave." The graveyard screamed. The ground cracked, graves splitting open all around him. Something moving beneath the earth. Something waiting. The last thing Daniel saw before the mist swallowed him was his own dead face, grinning. And then, darkness. Daniel awoke in the graveyard. Again, the rain whispered against the headstones, falling in slow, steady sheets, soaking through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, as his fingers clawed at the damp ground beneath him. The mist clung to the air, thick and unmoving, curling around the graves like skeletal fingers reaching from below. His body ached. His mind felt fractured. Something was wrong, very wrong. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his pulse hammering against his skull. The flashlight lay beside him, its weak beam flickering, its light barely reaching past his own trembling hands. A sense of déjà vu wrapped around him like a noose. This had happened before, hadn't it? His breath hitched in his throat as the memory surged back, running through the graveyard. The laughter, the thing that wore his face, the grave splitting open beneath his feet. And yet, here he was, whole, breathing, trapped. His eyes darted around, searching for something, anything that looked different. But the cemetery was the same, always the same. Rows of headstones stretching endlessly into the mist. The skeletal trees swaying under the weight of the rain. The iron fence standing in the distance, farther than it should have been. His stomach twisted. He remembered running toward the exit. He remembered falling. But now, the gate was gone. His fingers dug into the wet dirt as he forced himself to stand. His knees shaking, his breath uneven. His body felt real. The cold, the rain, the way his muscles ached. It felt real. But was it? The thought sent a cold spike of fear through his spine. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the graves, the trees, the mist curling at his feet. The whispering was gone. The laughter was gone. But something else was here. Something watching. He felt it in the weight of the air, in the way his skin prickled, in the deep, suffocating silence, pressing against his ears. And then, a sound, not whispering, not laughter, digging. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. The sound was slow, deliberate, the soft, wet scrape of something pulling at the earth. It came from behind him, the grave, his grave. He turned, the flashlight trembling in his grip as he directed it toward the source of the noise. The beam landed on a mound of freshly turned soil, and the dirt was moving. His breath hitched. Something underneath the grave was clawing its way up. A hand, thin, gray, fingers gnarled and broken, breached the surface. Daniel stumbled backward, his pulse slamming against his ribs. No, this couldn't be happening. The fingers twitched, grasping, reaching. The dirt shifted again, something pulling itself free. And then he saw it, his own face, half buried, eyes closed, mouth slack. His body. Daniel let out a strangled gasp, his knees nearly giving out beneath him. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the thing in the grave, his corpse, opened its eyes, and it saw him. A choked sound escaped his throat as he staggered backward, the mud sucking at his boots. His breath came in rapid, panicked gulps, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body stayed frozen. The thing wearing his face blinked once, slow, mechanical, then it smiled. Daniel turned and ran, his feet pounded against the wet ground, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. His lungs burned as he sprinted through the rows of graves, the trees blurring past him, the mist thickening around his legs, trying to slow him down. The digging continued behind him, faster now, more frantic, the wet slap of something pulling itself out of the grave. He didn't look back, he couldn't. His only thought was get out, find the gate, escape. But then, the graveyard shifted. The path he was following twisted, graves appearing where there had been none. The fence, his way out was gone. His chest tightened. No. No, he had been here before. He had done this before. He was trapped. A cold, sharp breath sent a chill through his spine. Behind him, he turned, and there it was, standing at the edge of the mist, himself pale, empty-eyed, grinning. Daniel's breath caught. His vision swam. His head felt heavy, too heavy. And then, the thing spoke. "You never leave." The word shattered through him, pulling at his mind, at his soul. And this time, Daniel didn't fight when the darkness took him. Daniel's eyes snapped open. He was lying on the wet ground, the rain falling softly against his skin, the scent of damp earth filling his nostrils. Again, the graveyard stretched around him in silent familiarity. The same rows of crooked headstones, the same skeletal trees, the same suffocating mist curling through the air like something alive. His breath shuddered as he sat up, his fingers digging into the soft dirt beneath him. He knew this place. He knew what was happening. He had been here before. A sickening weight settled in his chest as the memories returned. The whispering, the shifting graves, the thing that wore his face, the endless cycle. No, this couldn't be real. He forced himself to stand, his legs weak, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His flashlight lay beside him, its beam flickering uselessly. He picked it up anyway, his grip tight around the cold metal. He had to get out. He had to break this. He turned toward where the gate should have been, but before he could take a step, a whisper slithered through the mist. "You never learn." Daniel froze. The voice was his. Slowly, painfully, he turned. The mist curled away, revealing a figure standing among the graves, himself pale, dead-eyed, grinning that same awful empty grin. The thing took a slow step forward, its bare feet sinking into the mud. Its arms hung at its sides, unnaturally long, its fingers twitching, eager. Daniel's pulse pounded against his skull. His grip on the flashlight tightened until his knuckles turned white. No, not this time. He took a step back. The thing took a step forward. Daniel turned and ran. The laughter followed him, dry and hollow, threading through the mist. "You always run. You always fail." The graveyard stretched endlessly, the headstones shifting, the paths changing. Daniel didn't stop. He couldn't. His breath burned in his lungs, his legs aching with the effort. The rain blurred his vision, the cold clinging to his skin like something alive. He just had to find the gate. He just had to assign. A hand closed around his wrist, cold, wet, fingers digging into his skin with impossible strength. He screamed. Daniel was yanked backward, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. His flashlight flew from his grip, landing somewhere in the darkness. The laughter grew louder. And then, the thing was on top of him. Its face was his. Its breath was his. Its voice was a twisted, warped version of his own, echoing from somewhere deep within its hollow, gaping mouth. "This is where you belong," Daniel thrashed, his body screaming in protest. The weight of the thing pressed against his chest, heavy, crushing. The mud beneath him shifted, the earth opening up. He was sinking. The grave was swallowing him. "No," he gasped, clawing at the ground, struggling against the thing that held him down. "No, I won't. You always do." The last thing Daniel saw was his own lifeless face, grinning down at him as the earth pulled him under. And then, darkness. Daniel awoke to the feeling of damp earth pressing against his back. The rain still fell. The mist still swirled between the graves. His body ached as he stared up at the dark sky, his breath coming in slow, uneven gulps. No, not again. A low, shuddering exhale slipped from his lips as he sat up, his fingers sinking into the wet soil. The flashlight lay beside him, just like before, its flickering beam barely piercing the darkness. The graveyard stretched endlessly, its winding paths shifting, its graves standing too straight, too still, too expectant. He had been here before. He had died. Again. Daniel clenched his teeth, his hands trembling as he shoved himself upright. He was shaking, his skin cold, his mind fighting against the reality of what was happening. How many times had this happened? How long had he been trapped here? His breath shuddered as he turned in slow circles, scanning the cemetery for something, anything that could break the cycle. The whispering had stopped. The laughter had stopped. But the silence was worse. It felt thick. Watching, he forced his legs to move, taking slow, deliberate steps toward where the gate should have been. It wouldn't be there. He knew it wouldn't. But he had to try. One step, another. The earth felt soft beneath his boots, like it was waiting for him to sink. The mist curled, shifting like it was alive, retreating from his path in slow, deliberate movements. And then, a sound, not whispering, not laughter, a heartbeat. Deep, slow, not his. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound came from below. The ground pulsed beneath his feet, something breathing beneath the graves, something awake. A cold wave of terror crashed over him as he staggered back, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The flashlight flickered wildly, the shadows stretching, twisting, and then, the graves opened, one by one. The dirt cracked, splitting apart. Hands emerged, thin, rotted, clawing at the earth. Daniel ran. The whispering returned, but this time it was different. Not his voice, not laughter, crying, soft mournful sobs, drifting through the mist, tangled with the sound of shifting earth, with the slow creak of something ancient waking beneath the ground. He didn't stop running. He couldn't. The graves were opening everywhere. Shapes pulled themselves from the earth, their bodies twisted, unfinished, half-formed, faces with hollow eyes, mouths that opened but didn't breathe. They reached for him. Daniel's legs burned as he sprinted toward the fence, toward the exit that had never been there, toward the hope he knew was a lie. But this time, something was different. The mist shifted, the cemetery changed, and ahead of him, standing in the fog, was a figure. Not a creature, not a corpse, a man. He was tall, his face obscured by the rain, his clothes old, tattered. His presence felt different from the things Daniel had seen before. Daniel skidded to a stop, his breath ragged. The man tilted his head. Then in a low, steady voice, he spoke. "You don't belong here." The earth shuddered. The whispering turned to screaming, and Daniel's world broke apart. The world shattered. Daniel's vision blurred as the graveyard fractured around him. The mist twisting, the trees bending backward as if something had yanked reality itself apart. The air rippled, thick with unseen force, and the ground beneath his feet trembled like it was about to give way again. The man stood still in the fog, tall, unmoving, watching. His presence was unlike the others, not twisted, not wrong. Daniel's breath hitched, his legs ached from running, but his body refused to move. Something about the man held him in place. The whispering shifted, the sobbing turned to pleading. Voices, layered and broken, rising from the earth itself. "Help us, please. We are still here." Daniel's stomach twisted. The graves were moving, their edges pulling apart, as if something was trying to climb free. The man turned his head toward the graves, then back toward Daniel. "You need to wake up." Daniel's breath shuddered, his fingers curled into fists, nails biting into his palms. "What?" His own voice felt weak, distant. "Wake up. I'm not asleep." The man stepped closer. "You've never been awake." Daniel took a step back. His vision swam. The mist thickened, pressing against him like unseen hands. The world tilted around him, distorting, and suddenly, memories flooded through his mind. Not just from tonight, from before. The bar, the bat, his friends laughing, shoving money across the table, the graveyard gate groaning open. The first time he walked in, the first time he got lost, the first time he died. The moment stretched, long and suffocating, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He had never left. He had never escaped. Daniel's breath hitched. He shook his head, fighting it. "No, that's not. This isn't." The man took another step forward. "Listen to me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You are caught between places, and if you don't fight it, you'll become part of it, just like the others." Daniel's skin went cold. The others, the ones buried in the graves, the ones that had called out to him, the ones who had never left. His knees nearly buckled, his heartbeat hammering in his skull. "I don't know how to get out." "You do." The man's face remained hidden in the mist, but his voice was steady. "You have to remember who you are, and you have to stop running." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the rain. The whispering grew frantic, the graves convulsed, as if whatever lay beneath knew what was happening. The mist curled tighter, the wind howled, and behind him, something moved, slow, heavy, a shape in the fog, the thing that wore his face. It had come back. Daniel turned, his breath catching as his own dead eyes stared back at him. The thing grinned. "You never leave," it whispered. Daniel's hands clenched. The fear clawed at his ribs, screaming for him to run like he always had. But this time, he didn't. This time, he stood his ground. The whispering roared. The mist screamed. The thing lunged for him, and Daniel let it. The moment its hands touched him, the graveyard collapsed. The mist pulled away, torn like fabric. The graves caved in, swallowing themselves whole. The whispering turned to a single, shuddering exhale. And then, silence. For the first time, true silence. The rain had stopped. The wind had died. Daniel stood, his breath shaking, his body still here. The man stood a few feet away, watching. The graveyard was changing. The headstones were fading. The trees were withering into nothing. The asterisk gate, the real one, was ahead of him, a way out. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands still trembling. "What happens if I leave?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he simply said, "Wake up." Daniel's vision blurred. The world broke apart. And then, he opened his eyes. Daniel opened his eyes. The first thing he felt was cold air. Real air filling his lungs. The scent of damp earth and rain still clung to him. But something was different. The weight pressing against his chest was gone. The suffocating mist, the endless graves, the thing that wore his face, all of it had vanished. He was lying on his back, staring up at the sky. Not the twisting dead sky of the graveyard. A real sky, gray, overcast. Dawn creeping through the storm clouds. Daniel's breath hitched. His fingers dug into the ground beneath him, feeling grass, solid earth. The graveyard was still there, but different, smaller, normal. The rows of headstones no longer stretched endlessly into the fog. The trees were just trees, bare branches, wet with rain. The iron gate, still rusted and worn, stood where it should have been. It was just a cemetery, a place of the dead, not a place that was alive. His body shook as he sat up, his head spinning, his breath unsteady. His clothes were soaked through, his skin freezing. He could still feel it, the weight of everything. The voices, the laughter, the endless cycle. He had been trapped there. But now he was awake. His heart hammered in his chest as he slowly pushed himself to his feet. His legs ached, his muscles stiff, but he was here. And then, a sound, not whispering, not laughter, a car. Daniel turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the distant road just beyond the cemetery fence. A single car, headlights still on, was parked just outside the gate. And then he saw them. People, a small group of them, familiar faces, his friends. Daniel's chest tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. The bet, the dare, had they been waiting for him, looking for him, or had he ever been gone at all? His breath shuddered. How much time had passed? Slowly, his feet carrying him forward with an eerie numbness. Daniel walked toward the gate. His hands touched the rusted iron, fingers curling around the cold bars. It was real. He could feel it. And then, one of his friends, a woman with dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail, turned. Her eyes widened. Daniel. His stomach twisted. Her voice was too relieved, as if she hadn't seen him in a long time. Daniel's throat felt dry. He tried to speak, but no words came. The rest of the group turned, their faces shifting from shock to something else, something hesitant. "Jesus, man," another friend breathed, stepping closer. "Where the hell have you been?" Daniel's fingers tightened around the gate. His breathing slowed. Something was wrong. He looked at them, really looked at them. They were the same, but not. Older, tired, like they had been waiting for him for longer than just a night. His heart pounded against his ribs. The weight of the graveyard still wrapped around him. His voice finally came back. "How long?" The group exchanged uneasy glances. The woman with the ponytail took a slow step forward, her voice quiet. "Daniel, it's been 6 years." The world lurched, the graveyard creaked behind him, and in the distant mist, unseen but still there, something laughed. Daniel took a slow breath and made his choice. He stepped forward, gripping the rusted iron gate, his pulse still uneven, his body still aching with the weight of something unseen. His friends were waiting, watching. Their relief was real, but beneath it, something else lingered, hesitation. He could feel their unease. As he crossed the threshold, leaving the graveyard behind, Claire let out a shaky breath, almost laughing, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jesus, Daniel, we thought you were dead." Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to nod. "So did I." The rain fell around them, steady, rhythmic, the storm finally beginning to clear. Then, a gust of wind rushed through the graveyard behind him, cold, sharp, wrong. The iron gate creaked open, groaning on its rusted hinges. Daniel stiffened. His friends didn't react, not to the sound, not to the way the wind carried something with it. Something faint, something almost too quiet to hear. A whisper, his own voice. "You never left." Daniel's breath hitched, his fingers twitched at his sides. His friends were already walking toward the car, talking, moving on. But Daniel, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, and that maybe, just maybe, it was right. The old house stood alone at the edge of the forest, where the road narrowed into a winding gravel path. It was the kind of place that seemed forgotten by time, its wooden walls weathered by the years, its windows staring out like hollow eyes. The town nearby spoke of it in hushed tones, recounting stories of strange noises at night, of figures glimpsed in the upstairs windows, of lights that flickered even though the electricity had long since been cut. Eleanor had never believed in those stories. She was pragmatic, grounded. She had spent her life as a caregiver, tending to the elderly and infirm, always the rational one in the face of fear. So when she found the listing for the house, dirt cheap, isolated and in need of work, she saw it as an opportunity rather than a warning, a place to start over, away from the memories that still haunted her in the city. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth. As she stepped onto the front porch, the key turned stiffly in the lock, the door creaking open with a groan that echoed through the empty halls. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked beneath her weight. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind her. Nights in the house were different. The silence was vast, pressing against her ears with an almost tangible weight. The wind whispered through the eaves, and the trees outside swayed, their branches scratching against the windows. It was easy to dismiss the creaks and groans of the house settling, easy to blame the scurrying sounds in the walls on mice. But then came the footsteps. At first they were faint, distant, as if coming from the far end of the house. A rhythmic shuffle, then a pause, then another step. Eleanor listened, frozen in her bed, her breath caught in her throat. When she mustered the courage to investigate, she found nothing, only empty halls and darkened rooms. She told herself it was the wind, the old pipes, the house shifting under its own weight. But as the days passed, the sounds became more deliberate. The footsteps would stop just outside her bedroom door. She would lie there, rigid with fear, listening to the breathless silence on the other side of the wood, feeling the heavy stillness of something waiting. And then the whispers began. They slithered through the house in the dead of night, low and insistent, just below the threshold of comprehension. Eleanor would strain to catch the words, but they dissolved the moment she tried to focus on them. Like mist in the morning sun, she told herself she was imagining things, that the isolation was playing tricks on her mind. But the truth gnawed at the edges of her resolve. One night, as the wind howled outside, and the house groaned with its own unseen weight, Eleanor woke to a new sound, a slow, deliberate creak from the foot of her bed. She didn't move, barely dared to breathe. The darkness seemed to swell, thick and suffocating, as if something unseen was standing there, watching. She reached for the lamp beside her bed, fingers trembling, and switched it on. The room was empty, but the closet door, which she always kept shut, stood open by an inch. Heart pounding, she slid out of bed and approached it. every nerve in her body screaming for her to run. The air inside the closet was colder, the kind of chill that sank into bone. She reached out hesitating, then grasped the doorknob and yanked it fully open. Nothing, just hanging clothes swaying gently, as if disturbed. She barely slept that night, and when she did, she dreamed of shadows that whispered her name. The next morning, she resolved to leave. She packed her bag in a hurry, stuffing clothes and belongings into it with shaking hands. As she zipped it shut, a sudden noise froze her in place. A soft, slow knock, not at the front door, but from inside the house. Her breath hitched. The knock came again, this time from the hallway outside her room. Eleanor turned, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The air felt thick, heavy with something unseen. And then, she saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, half hidden in the shadows, its form twisted and unnatural. It didn't move. It only stood there watching. Eleanor's scream never left her throat, as the lights flickered, and the darkness swallowed everything whole. The next thing she knew, she was lying on the floor, the dim morning light filtering through the cracked curtains. Her body ached, her mind foggy, as if she had been drugged. But she was alone. No figure, no whispers. The closet door was shut. Her packed bag sat at the foot of her bed, untouched. A new fear settled into her bones, one not of ghosts or the supernatural, but of something more insidious. Was she losing her mind? Determined to get out, Eleanor grabbed her bag and stormed toward the front door. The knob was cold under her palm, but it turned easily. The door swung open to reveal the long empty road leading back to town. She took a breath of relief, until she saw the footprints. They trailed from the house, deep in the dirt, leading into the forest. Not hers. Her throat tightened. The prints were too large, the gait uneven, like something had stumbled out into the trees. Had it left, or was it waiting? A rustling sound came from the woods, the dry whisper of leaves shifting. The air grew still, the world holding its breath. Eleanor clutched her bag to her chest and took a step back. Then the whisper came again, curling around her ears like fingers in the dark. Not yet. The front door slammed shut behind her. Eleanor stood frozen on the front porch, her breath ragged, heart hammering against her ribs. The footprints in the dirt trailed into the forest, vanishing among the tangled roots and mist that clung low to the ground. She wanted to believe it was an animal, that maybe she had overlooked her own steps in her frantic rush to escape. But deep down, she knew better. The whisper still echoed in her ears. Not yet. The words had curled around her like a snake, squeezing the air from her lungs. She forced herself to step back, turning toward her car, parked just beyond the gate. The old sedan sat where she left it, coated in a thin layer of damp leaves, as if the forest itself had begun to reclaim it overnight. She fumbled for her keys, her fingers trembling. The car door groaned as she yanked it open and threw herself into the driver's seat. She jammed the key into the ignition, twisting it hard. The engine coughed once, twice, then fell silent. "No," she whispered, her breath fogging the windshield. She tried again. Click. Nothing. The battery was dead. A sound drifted from the woods, a slow dragging movement through the underbrush. Eleanor's hands gripped the steering wheel, her body frozen in place. She didn't want to look. She knew that if she turned her head, she would see something standing at the tree line, watching. The sound stopped. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. And then the footsteps began again. Slow, measured, closer. Her pulse roared in her ears. With a strangled breath, she threw open the car door and bolted for the house. The front door slammed behind her, and she pressed her back against it, gasping. The air inside was heavy, thick with dust, and something else, something old. A creak sounded from the upstairs landing. Her stomach clenched. She wasn't alone. The realization settled over her, like ice, numbing her limbs. She needed to get out. If the car wouldn't start, maybe she could run to the nearest house. It was miles away, but she was faster than whatever had been out there, wasn't she? She inched toward the nearest window, careful not to make a sound. The pale light of dawn had begun to bleed through the trees, casting long, twisting shadows across the lawn. The forest loomed just beyond, dark and impenetrable, And then she saw it, a figure, standing at the tree line, too tall, too still. The moment she laid eyes on it, the shape shifted, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. It had no face, just a smooth expanse of darkness, where its features should have been. But she felt it stare, a pressure against her chest, pinning her in place. A single step forward, then another. No, she stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. Her mind screamed for her to move, to run, but her body wouldn't listen. The figure took another step. The moment she blinked, it was gone. The silence in the house pressed in around her, wrapping her in its suffocating grip. She had to get out, had to move. And then the whisper slithered through the air again, so close it might have been right beside her ear. Not yet. A cold hand clamped onto her wrist. Eleanor screamed. Eleanor yanked her arm free, stumbling backwards so fast she tripped over the rug. She hit the floor hard, her breath punching out of her lungs. The room around her seemed to tilt, the dim light flickering as if the house itself was breathing. There was no one there, but the sensation of cold fingers still lingered on her wrist, as though something had touched her from beyond the veil of reality. Her body screamed at her to flee, but where? The front door led to the forest, where that thing had been watching her. The car was useless, the nearest house was miles away, and yet, staying inside felt like a slow death, like she was prey waiting to be devoured. The floor above creaked. Eleanor sucked in a sharp breath. Something moved upstairs. The sound was subtle, just the faintest shift of weight. The whisper of fabric brushing against the wooden floor. A presence, waiting. Her skin prickled with awareness. She had lived alone for years, but never had she felt so watched. Another step above her, then another. It wasn't just standing there, it was coming down. The staircase was just around the corner, out of sight. If she stayed, she'd see it when it reached the bottom. Whatever it was. No. Her body moved before she could think. She lunged for the hallway, gripping the doorknob to the basement. It was the only place left to go. The old wooden door groaned as it swung open, and she plunged into the darkness below, pulling it shut behind her just as the last creak of the staircase stopped. Just outside the door, she clamped a hand over her mouth, barely breathing. Silence. A long, aching silence. Then knock. A single deliberate knock on the door. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. A second knock followed. Slow, methodical. A third. Then the whisper came again, seeping through the cracks of the wood. Not yet. The doorknob turned. She staggered down the steps, nearly tripping in her desperation to put distance between herself and whatever was on the other side. The basement was freezing, the kind of cold that clung to the bones. She fumbled for a light switch, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and finally, her fingers found the chain of a single bare bulb. She yanked it. A dull glow filled the basement. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, the walls whispered, not just from the door above, but from all around her. A chorus of voices, layered over one another, overlapping in an unintelligible murmur. Some fast, some slow, some no more than the sound of dry lips parting in the dark. Her stomach turned to ice. The walls of the basement were covered in scratches, deep, desperate gouges in the wood and stone, claw marks that crisscrossed over each other, like the frantic attempts of someone, or something trying to escape. Eleanor's breath hitched, and then she noticed the other door. It stood at the far end of the basement, half rotted, a rusted chain hanging loosely from where it had once been locked. The scratches on the walls led to it. Not away, something had been kept inside, and now the door was open. A whisper barely audible curled around her ears. Not yet. A shadow moved. Eleanor turned, and something stepped out of the dark. Eleanor's body locked up, her breath frozen in her throat. The figure emerging from the darkness was not human, not entirely. It was tall, impossibly thin, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it stepped forward. The dim light from the flickering bulb above barely touched its form, as if the shadows clung to it like a second skin. It had no face, and yet she felt it staring at her. The whisper slithered through the air again, curling around her spine like fingers, dragging down her back. Not yet. Eleanor stumbled back, her foot catching on an old crate. She crashed to the floor, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The air in the basement had grown thick, oppressive, pressing against her like unseen hands, forcing her down. The figure moved with a sickening grace, its limbs unfolding in ways they shouldn't, stretching too long, too fluid. It did not walk, it glided, closing the distance between them with unnatural silence. Eleanor scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the cold floor. The whisper came again, closer this time, almost inside her head. Not yet. Her back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to go. The thing loomed over her now, its shape flickering, shifting, as if it existed between reality and something else. The shadows twisted around it, moving, even though there was no wind. Then, it breathed, a slow, deliberate inhale, as if tasting her fear. Eleanor shut her eyes, a silent scream caught in her throat, and then, it stopped. The weight in the air lifted. The whispers fell silent. The presence, the pressing, suffocating dread, all of it vanished as if it had never been there. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. The basement was empty. Her chest heaved, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had she imagined it? Was the house playing tricks on her? No. The scratches on the walls, the cold hand that had grabbed her, the whisper, something was wrong with this house. She had to leave. Now. Eleanor forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. She didn't dare look at the open door, at the far end of the basement, didn't want to see if something was still watching from the black void beyond. Her only thought was out. The basement door loomed at the top of the stairs. She took a step toward it, then another. Her heart pounded with every inch she gained, her ears straining for any sound, any sign that it had returned. The whisper didn't come. The air remained still. She reached for the doorknob and twisted it. Locked. No, no, no. She rattled it harder, panic flaring in her chest. She had not locked the door behind her. It couldn't be locked. And then from the other side, a single deliberate knock. Eleanor's breath hitched. Then another knock. And another. A slow measured rhythm. Then from just beyond the wood, the voice came again, its breath curling around her ears. Not yet. The light bulb exploded. The basement was plunged into absolute darkness. Eleanor screamed. Eleanor's scream was swallowed by the suffocating dark. The shards of the shattered light bulb crunched under her bare feet as she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the cold, unyielding wall. She could hear it, the whispering. Not just one voice now, many. A low guttural chorus seeping from the cracks in the walls, from the unseen corners of the basement. The sound curled around her like a mist, sinking into her skin. The words were still just beyond comprehension, slithering and writhing in a language that shouldn't exist. And then came the breathing, deep, slow, not hers. It was close, too close. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. She forced herself to move, to run. Her hands fumbled blindly in the dark, sweeping across cold stone, knocking over rusted tools and forgotten debris. The basement was vast, larger than she remembered. No, that wasn't right. It was changing. The walls no longer felt like the rough brick and splintered wood she had seen before. They were smooth, damp, pulsing slightly beneath her fingertips, as if she were trapped inside something that was alive. She bit back a sob, willing herself forward. The basement door had to be there. It had to be. Her hands found something solid. Wood. The door. Eleanor's fingers closed around the knob and twisted, locked. No. She yanked at it, desperation giving her strength. But the door didn't budge. The knocking had stopped, replaced by something worse. A presence, standing behind her. Eleanor didn't turn. She would not turn. A voice, barely more than a breath, pressed against her ear. Not yet. Cold fingers slid over her shoulder. She screamed, throwing herself against the door with all her might. The wood shuddered, but didn't give. The fingers gripped harder, curling around her arm, pulling her backward. Eleanor flailed, kicking, twisting, her free hand finding something sharp on the ground. She didn't know what it was, didn't care. She swung it blindly. A terrible sound tore through the dark. A shriek, inhuman and raw, rattled the very walls of the basement. The grip on her arm vanished, and Eleanor fell forward, slamming against the door. It burst open. She tumbled out, gasping, crashing onto the wooden floor of the hallway above. The air was thick, stale, but it was air. It was real. She scrambled forward, desperate to put as much distance between herself and that basement as possible. She kicked the door shut behind her, and then silence. The house was still. No whispers, no footsteps. The basement had returned to the quiet void it had always been. But Eleanor knew the truth. It was waiting. She didn't stop. She ran through the house, heart hammering, lungs burning. The front door loomed ahead, its old brass handle gleaming under the dim light of morning. She lunged for it, wrenching it open. A wall of cold, damp air slammed into her. She froze. The world outside was wrong. The trees were taller than before, twisting gnarled things that clawed at the sky. The road that had once led to town was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of fog. The sky itself had darkened, as if the sun had retreated behind something far worse than clouds. She stepped onto the porch, eyes wide, breath shaky. The air smelled of wet earth, and something rotting. The forest was breathing. A rustling sound came from the trees, not the wind, something moving. She took another step. The whisper followed, not yet. Eleanor's vision blurred. Her head throbbed with a sharp, unnatural pain, and the world around her seemed to shift. The house, the forest, the air itself, everything twisted, flickered, stretched in ways it shouldn't. And then, it stepped out of the trees, a tall, gaunt figure, its limbs unnaturally long, its body barely more than a shadow given shape. It did not walk, it glided, the mist parting around it. It had no face, and yet she felt it looking at her. A single long finger lifted, pointing directly at her. The whisper crawled through her mind. Not yet. Eleanor turned and ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't, because she knew if she saw it again, she would never leave. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing into the wet, tangled grass. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her vision swimming. She had no idea how long she had been running. The house was gone, swallowed by the trees. The mist had thickened, wrapping around her like a cocoon. She was lost. And then, in the distance, a light, flickering, weak, a cabin. Eleanor's pulse surged. She forced herself to her feet, stumbling toward it. If someone lived there, they could help her. Maybe they had a phone. Maybe they could tell her where she was. She reached the door and knocked. The sound echoed in the silence. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the knob. The door creaked open under her touch. Inside, the cabin was empty. Dust-covered furniture sat untouched, and the air smelled of age and decay. A single candle flickered on a nearby table, the wax pooling around its base. Eleanor stepped inside cautiously, and then she saw it. A journal, open on the table. The writing was frantic, scrawled across the pages in uneven strokes. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the words. If you found this, it's too late. It doesn't let you leave. The longer you stay, the more you forget. Run. Eleanor's breath hitched. She turned the page and froze, because the last entry wasn't written in the same frantic hand. It was neat, precise, and it read, "Welcome back, Eleanor." The candle went out, and the whisper came from right behind her. Not yet. Eleanor couldn't move. The whisper still clung to her ears, a sickening reminder that she was not alone. The room was pitch dark now, the only sound her ragged breathing. She tried to force herself to turn, to see whatever was behind her, but every nerve in her body screamed, "Don't look." She felt it, a presence just behind her, unmoving, watching. The air grew dense, pressing against her skin like unseen hands, closing around her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there in paralyzed terror. But then, the whisper came again, "Not yet." And just like that, the pressure lifted. The cabin returned to stillness. The suffocating presence was gone. Or at least, it wanted her to think it was. Eleanor sucked in a shaky breath, forcing her legs to move. She took a single step forward, then another, careful not to make a sound. She needed light, Her trembling fingers fumbled along the wooden table until they found the matches beside the melted candle. She struck one. Flick. The tiny flame sputtered to life, casting trembling shadows against the walls. Nothing. The cabin was empty. But Eleanor knew better. She turned back to the journal, her hands shaking as she flipped through the pages. Most of the writing was frantic, scrawled in the same desperate hand. Warnings, please. And then, at the very back, a single newly written sentence. You shouldn't have come back. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The candle flickered. Something shifted in the corner of the room. A breath low, deliberate, not hers. The flame went out, and the whisper came again. Not yet. Eleanor ran. She didn't think, didn't look back. She bolted for the door, shoving it open so hard it nearly came off its hinges. Outside, the fog had thickened. The world beyond the porch was wrong, shifting and unnatural, as if the landscape was watching her. She had to get away. She stumbled forward, the grass wet and cold beneath her bare feet. Every step felt heavier, like something was pulling her back. She reached the edge of the trees and stopped dead. The forest was gone. In its place stood the house. Her house, but that was impossible. She had left it. She had run. The whisper drifted through the air, soft and cruel. You never left. The front door creaked open, and inside, in the darkened hallway, something moved, waiting, watching, welcoming her back. Eleanor let out a sob, and then, against every screaming instinct, she stepped inside. The moment Eleanor crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her. The air inside was thick, as if she had stepped into a place untouched by time. The house felt different now, larger, deeper, like the walls no longer obeyed the laws of reality. She turned, her pulse hammering. The door was gone, just smooth, unbroken wall. No escape. The house had swallowed her whole. A sound crept from the shadows. Footsteps, soft, measured, coming down the stairs. She pressed herself against the wall, eyes locked on the landing above. The dim glow of the hallway light barely reached past the first few steps, leaving the top shrouded in blackness. But something was there. She could hear it breathing. The whisper returned, curling around her mind like tendrils of shadow. Not yet. Eleanor clenched her fists, forcing herself to move. She darted down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. Every door she passed was wrong. They didn't lead where they should. The kitchen had become a stairwell, leading downward into blackness. The living room was now a hallway, stretching endlessly, lined with doors that didn't belong. Nothing in the house was real anymore. She skidded to a stop, her breath hitching. At the very end of the hall, something waited. A mirror, large, antique, its surface warped and shifting, as if it were breathing. Eleanor took a step closer, her reflection barely visible in the murky glass. No, not her reflection, something else. It watched her from the other side, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. She knew deep in her bones, if she looked too long, she would see its face, and she could never let that happen. A new sound cut through the silence, scraping, soft at first, then louder, more frantic. From inside the walls, Eleanor's breath came in short, panicked gasps. The scratching surrounded her now, like dozens of fingernails clawing at the wood, trying to get out. Then the mirror rippled. Her reflection moved on its own, and it smiled. The whisper came again, inside her head this time, sinking into her skin, her bones. Not yet. The walls shuddered. The scratching turned to pounding. Eleanor ran. She didn't know where she was going. The house had become a labyrinth, twisting and shifting as she moved. She reached a door, one she didn't recognize. No time to hesitate. She threw it open and fell. Darkness swallowed her whole. The last thing she heard before everything went black was laughter and the whisper, "Not yet." Eleanor hit the ground hard, or at least, she thought she did. The impact never came. Instead, she was falling, still falling. The darkness around her was vast, endless, swallowing every inch of light. It felt like tumbling through deep water. The air thick and weightless, her limbs slow and heavy. She had no idea how long it lasted. Seconds, minutes, hours. Time meant nothing here. Then, her feet touched solid ground. The moment she made contact, the world shifted. She was standing, no more falling, no more void, just silence. Her breath came in short, shaky bursts as she reached out in the dark, searching for something, anything, to orient herself. The air was stale, thick with dust, and something else, something rotten. A dim glow flickered to life in the distance, a single flickering candle. The sight sent a violent shudder through her body. She knew this candle. It was the same one from the cabin, the same one that had gone out before the whisper had come. Not yet. Eleanor swallowed hard. She didn't want to move, didn't want to step closer, but the darkness around her was alive, pressing in, watching. She had no choice. Her feet dragged forward, the ground beneath her soft, almost pulsing beneath her weight. She reached the candle, its feeble light barely illuminating the space around her. That's when she saw them. The doors, they stretched endlessly in every direction, towering above her, each one identical, old wooden, their surfaces worn and splintered. Some looked ancient, others fresh, as if someone had just built them, and every single one had deep, frantic scratches around the frame, like something had tried to get out. Eleanor's throat tightened. A gust of cold air swept through the space. The candle flickered violently. Then, a knock, soft at first, then again, harder this time. It wasn't coming from just one door. It was coming from all of them. A chorus of knocks, rhythmic and deliberate. Something was inside, waiting. The whisper came again, curling around her like smoke. Not yet. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Eleanor's breath came fast and uneven. She had to move. She had to get out. But where? There were too many doors. Then, as if sensing her hesitation, one door creaked open. Just an inch. Darkness yawned beyond it. No light. No sound. Just waiting. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She didn't want to go in, but she didn't want to stay out here either. She took a step closer. The darkness shifted. Something moved beyond the doorway. Not footsteps. Breathing. Shallow. Wet. Wrong. Eleanor's entire body screamed at her to run, to not step inside. But the whisper slid into her ears. Gentle. Coaxing. Not yet. And before she could stop herself, she stepped through the door. The moment Eleanor crossed the threshold, the world collapsed around her. She expected to fall again, to be swallowed by the void. But instead, she was back in the house. Her house. The air was thick with dust, just as it had been before. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet, the hallway stretching before her in eerie silence. It was as if nothing had changed, as if she had never left. Her breath hitched. No, no, something was wrong. The layout was off. The hallway was longer, the ceiling lower. The walls seemed to pulse ever so slightly, as if the house itself were alive. She turned. The door she had stepped through was gone. Just another endless stretch of hallway behind her. Panic clawed up her throat. She turned back, forcing herself forward. She had to get out. She moved quickly, her steps echoing against the wood. The walls seemed to breathe, pressing closer with each passing second. Then, a shadow shifted ahead. Eleanor froze. Something was standing at the end of the hallway, tall, unmoving, watching. She couldn't see its face, couldn't see any features at all, just a void in the shape of a person. The air grew colder, the house groaned, and then, it moved. Not walked, not ran. It glided toward her, silent and slow. Eleanor stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. Run, move, do something. Her legs finally obeyed. She turned and ran. The hallway stretched longer, the doors blurring past her. The floor beneath her shifted, turning uneven, as if it wanted her to fall. A sound followed her. Not footsteps, not whispers, laughter. Low, guttural, inhuman. The air grew thick again, pressing in, forcing her down. She gasped, legs failing her. She collapsed onto the floor. The laughter stopped. A single whisper, low and deliberate, echoed all around her. Not yet. And then, the floor disappeared beneath her. She was falling again. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was the smiling figure watching from above. And this time, she saw its face. Eleanor plunged into the abyss, the sensation of falling wrapped around her, endless and consuming. But this time, it was different. The air was thicker, heavier, pressing against her skin, as if she were sinking into something far worse than darkness. It was watching her, the faceless thing, the presence that had whispered to her, the one that had been waiting. She could feel it, know them. There were many, shifting shadows in the void. She couldn't see them, but she could feel their eyes. They were everywhere. She tried to scream, but the sound was stolen from her throat. The air grew colder, sharp as knives against her skin. The falling slowed, and then she stopped. The impact should have shattered her bones, but there was no pain, no force. One moment, she was plummeting, and the next she was standing. The darkness peeled away. Eleanor found herself in a room. Not the house, not the endless, shifting hallways. This place was different. The walls were lined with mirrors. Dozens, hundreds, each one stretching from floor to ceiling, reflecting a warped, twisted version of herself. Her breath caught. The reflections weren't moving with her. They twitched, shuddering, eyes locked onto her with silent intensity. Some grinned too wide, their mouths stretching far beyond human limits. Others tilted their heads in unison, slow and deliberate. Eleanor's heart pounded. She took a step forward. The reflections didn't. A wave of nausea rolled through her. The air hummed with something unseen. And then, one of the reflections spoke. Not yet. Eleanor stumbled back, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. The voice had come from all of them, a chorus of whispers, layered upon one another, echoing through the endless chamber of glass. The mirrors shuddered. Then, one cracked. A thin, jagged fracture ran down its center. Then another, and another. The room filled with the sound of splintering glass. As cracks spread like veins across every reflection, something was breaking through. Eleanor turned, running for the nearest doorway, but there was none. Just more mirrors, more twisted, smiling versions of herself. Then the mirrors burst apart. Shards of glass exploded through the air, slicing against her arms as she shielded her face. Silence. Eleanor slowly lifted her head. The mirrors were gone, and in their place, doors, dozens of them, lined in every direction, all identical. She was trapped again. And then, one of the doors opened. A familiar whisper slithered into her ears. Not yet. And from the darkness beyond the doorway, something stepped out. The figure moved slowly, its limbs unfolding with unnatural grace. It had no face, only a smooth, shifting void where its features should have been. But Eleanor knew it was looking at her. It saw her. It had always seen her. Her breath hitched as the figure took another step forward, its body flickering like a shadow cast by a dying flame. The whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't from the figure. It was inside her own head. Not yet. The world shifted. The doors vanished. The mirrors reappeared. But this time, they weren't empty. They weren't reflections. They were memories. Eleanor saw herself, but not as she was now. She was a child, standing outside this very house, her tiny hand gripping her mother's fingers. Then another mirror. She was older, standing on the porch alone, staring at the house with hesitant curiosity. Another. She was inside the house, standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at something in the dark. Each reflection played out pieces of her past, moments she had long forgotten, or had been made to forget. The whisper returned. Not yet. The shadows shifted. The figure moved closer. Eleanor's heartbeat slammed against her ribs. She tried to step back, but there was nowhere left to go. The mirrors were closing in. The figure raised its hand. Eleanor's vision blurred. The whispers filled her head, growing louder, sharper until they were screaming. And then, the world fractured. The mirrors shattered. The figure lunged forward, and Eleanor was somewhere else. She woke up outside. The grass was cold beneath her, damp with morning dew. The air smelled of earth and rain. Her house loomed ahead of her, the front door slightly ajar. The normal house. No endless hallways, no shifting walls, no whispering voids. Just the house. Had it been a dream, a hallucination? Eleanor sat up, her limbs aching as if she had run for miles. Her clothes were torn, dirt smudged across her skin. But she was out. She had escaped, hadn't she? Then she noticed it. The footprints in the grass, leading away from the house. Not hers. Large, uneven, dragging, and the final stomach-churning realization. There was only one set of footprints. Something had left the house, and it was no longer inside. It was out here, with her. The whisper came again, barely audible now, drifting on the wind like a final farewell. Not yet. Eleanor turned, and something was standing behind her. The whisper echoed one last time. Not yet. I never should have taken that road, but I was in a rush. It was supposed to be a quick detour, a shortcut through the back roads to save time. The highway had been backed up for miles, and my GPS offered an alternative, a nameless road cutting through the woods, something I'd never noticed before. The map called it Road 77, but I'd lived in this area for years, and had never heard of it. No signs, no markers, just a narrow cracked road, vanishing into the trees. It looked abandoned. I hesitated for only a second, before turning onto it. The pavement was rough, riddled with potholes. The trees were too dense, leaning over the road like skeletal fingers reaching down. The farther I drove, the darker it seemed to get, the canopy swallowing the sky. I checked the GPS. No service. I gritted my teeth and kept driving. The road twisted deeper into the wilderness, my headlights the only source of light. The outside world felt too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the hum of my engine, and the occasional crack of a branch under my tires. That's when I saw the first sign. It was old, rusted, half buried in the overgrown weeds on the side of the road. The words were barely legible, but I made them out as I passed. Do not stop. Keep driving. A nervous chuckle escaped my lips, probably a leftover from some local prank, or an old road warning from decades ago. I kept going. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I expected to see an exit, a turn-off, something, but the road just kept going. I checked the clock. 11:37 p.m. I had been driving for nearly an hour. I should have reached the next town by now. A chill crept down my spine. I turned on the radio to break the silence. Static, just endless static. I scanned through the channels. Nothing. Then a voice, faint, garbled, like a whisper cutting through the interference. My breath caught. I turned the volume up. The voice grew clearer, layered with distortion. Turn back. I slammed my foot on the brakes. The voice faded into static. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart hammering. I had no service, no map, and now a radio that was playing ghostly warnings. I needed to get out of here. I threw the car into reverse, and my headlights illuminated something in the road behind me. A figure, tall, motionless, standing in the middle of the highway. My blood turned to ice. The figure was wrapped in shadow, barely more than a silhouette against the darkened trees. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, watching, waiting. I hit the gas. The car roared forward. The figure didn't move. I swerved to avoid it, tires screeching as I tore down the road, and then the figure was gone, vanished. I gasped for breath, my knuckles white on the wheel. I had to be hallucinating. I had to be seeing things. That's when I saw the second sign. It hung from a twisted dead tree near the roadside. The words etched deep into the wood. There is no leaving. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I floored the gas. The trees blurred past me, their darkened shapes stretching impossibly high. The road ahead curved unnaturally, looping back on itself. I felt it then. A shift. The air had changed, like I had crossed an invisible threshold, like I was somewhere else now. Then the lights appeared, faint at first, just a distant glow through the trees. A town. A sign came into view, painted in bold white letters. Welcome to Oakside. But something was wrong. The town looked empty. The streets were deserted. The houses were dark. The storefronts abandoned. I slowed the car. The air felt thick, like stepping into a room that had been sealed shut for years. Something about this place felt familiar, like I'd seen it before, but I had never been here. Right. That's when I saw them. The figures, standing in the windows, standing in the streets, staring. Their faces were wrong, too smooth, too still. not blinking, not breathing, just watching me. Then, the car stalled, the engine went silent, and every single streetlight in the town shut off. The darkness swallowed everything, and I heard the first footstep, coming closer. The first footstep echoed through the darkness. Then another, slow, measured, coming closer. I fumbled for the car keys, twisting them in the ignition. Nothing. The engine was dead. I hit the lights. No response. My entire body tensed, every nerve screaming at me to move. Then, a sound, a slow, deliberate tap on the car window. I couldn't breathe. The darkness outside was thick, pressing against the glass like a living thing. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was right there, watching me. I squeezed my eyes shut. The sign, the one I had passed. Do not stop. Keep driving. I had broken the rule, and now, they had found me. I didn't dare turn my head, didn't dare look. Then, another tap, louder this time, right next to my face. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I needed to think, I needed a way out. Then I heard it, a whisper, muffled, distorted, from right outside the car. It didn't sound human. It was layered like more than one voice speaking at once, a chorus of whispers slithering through the silence. I forced myself to look, just a quick glance. I turned my head toward the window, and saw a handprint, pressed against the glass, not mine. Too large, too long. The fingers were stretched, unnatural, more than 5 of them. I gasped, my pulse spiking. I twisted the keys again, and the car roared to life. I slammed the gas, the tires screeched, the engine howled, and the car lurched forward. The darkness rushed past me, the town disappearing in the rearview mirror. But I could still feel them, watching, waiting, following. The road stretched ahead, winding into the abyss. The street signs were gone, no turns, no exits, just the endless highway. I checked my phone, still no service. The dashboard clock flickered. 4:44 a.m. I had left home at 11 p.m. That wasn't possible. I gritted my teeth, forcing my focus back to the road. Just keep driving. Then in the distance, headlights, a car. Relief washed over me. I flashed my high beams, signaling them to slow down. But something was wrong. The headlights were too bright, too steady. The car wasn't moving. I squinted, my hands tightening on the wheel. The headlights weren't attached to a car. They were just floating there. 2 perfect circles of light, hovering in the middle of the road. A sharp wave of nausea rolled through me. Then, they started to move, fast, straight at me. I yanked the wheel. The car veered off the road, crashing through thick brush, smashing against something solid. My head snapped forward. Darkness. Then, silence. I woke up to static. The car radio was playing a low, distorted hum. I groaned, my vision swimming, my body aching from the impact. I wasn't on the road anymore. I was somewhere else. A field, wide, empty. The trees loomed in the distance, but there was nothing around me. The road was gone. I checked the clock. It was still 4:44 a.m. Panic surged through me. I reached for my phone. No battery. I tried the car. Dead. And then in the rearview mirror, I saw them, standing at the edge of the field. The figures, still, motionless, watching me. Their faces were empty, smooth, featureless, but I could feel their eyes. And then, one of them took a step forward, then another, and another. I reached for the door handle, but before I could react, they were running, straight toward me. I threw the car door open and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The footsteps behind me were growing louder. Too many of them. Too fast. The field stretched ahead, endless and drenched in darkness. The trees in the distance never seemed to get closer. No road, no signs, no escape. My breath was ragged, my legs burning, but I kept going until the sound stopped. The footsteps, the rustling, everything, like someone had hit pause on the world. I skidded to a stop, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then, a whisper, right next to me. You shouldn't have stopped. I whirled around. Nothing. Just the field. The wind. The darkness. But the whisper had been so close. I wasn't alone. I started moving again. Slowly this time. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. This place, it wasn't normal. I had left the highway. I had left the town. So why did I feel like I was still trapped inside it? Then, in the distance, a light, flickering, weak, a single bulb, swinging above a gas station. I nearly collapsed in relief. I stumbled forward, my body aching. My breath came in ragged gasps. As I approached, the station looked old, abandoned. The windows were fogged over, cracked in places. The pumps were rusted, the numbers on the dials long faded. But the door was open. A small sign hung beside it. Open 24 hours. I hesitated. Something felt off, but I had nowhere else to go. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Dust. Something rotting. The air was thick, stale like it hadn't moved in years. The shelves were stocked, but everything looked wrong. The snack wrappers were faded, the cans coated in dust. The freezers hummed softly. But when I opened one, the inside was empty. No ice, no cold air, just darkness. I swallowed hard, stepping toward the counter. A cash register sat open, filled with old yellowed bills. A coffee pot steamed behind the counter, but the liquid inside was thick and black, bubbling too slowly. Then, a voice, "Need some gas." I froze. A man stood behind the counter. I hadn't seen him before. Had he been there the whole time? His face was thin, too pale. His uniform was spotless. Despite the filth around him, he smiled, but his teeth were too white. I took a slow step back. Yeah, I muttered. And I need a phone. The man's smile didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. There's no service out here. My stomach tightened. Of course there wasn't. Where am I? I asked. The man finally blinked. Oakside. My blood ran cold. No, I whispered. I left, I drove. The man tilted his head. You never left. I turned. The door was gone. The gas station was gone. I was standing in the middle of the road, and the town was in front of me, waiting. I couldn't breathe. I had run away. I had left the town behind. So how was I back? I turned in a circle, my pulse thundering in my ears. The road stretched ahead, identical to before. The buildings stood silent, their windows black and empty. And at the end of the street, the motel sign flickered weakly. Motel vacancy. I felt something shift in my mind. A memory, flashes of something I couldn't fully grasp. Me, checking in. The man behind the desk, his too perfect smile. The key in my hand. Room 304. A room that shouldn't exist. Something inside me screamed. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had to get out. I turned, and nearly collided with someone. A woman, tall, too thin. Her hair was long, tangled. Her eyes were too wide. She grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were freezing. You have to leave, she whispered. I stared at her. I tried. I choked out. She shook her head. Not like that. I swallowed hard. What does that mean? The woman glanced over her shoulder. Then she pressed something into my hand. A note, scrawled in shaking, uneven handwriting. There's only one way out. You have to. The rest was smudged, unreadable. I looked back at her. Her expression had changed. Fear. Run, she whispered. Then, she was yanked into the darkness. I barely saw it. A hand too long, too thin, grabbing her by the neck. A scream cut off too quickly. And then, she was gone. The town was silent again. Like nothing had happened. Like she had never existed. I staggered backward. My body screamed at me to move, to run. I turned, and a motel. Doors swung open. Warm light spilled out. A man stood in the entrance, smiling, holding a room key. Welcome back, he said. I opened my mouth, but the doors slammed shut, and every light in the town went out. The darkness swallowed everything, and I heard the footsteps coming closer. I ran. The buildings blurred around me, twisting like shadows, stretching in the wrong direction. The road beneath my feet felt too soft, too unstable, like I was running on something that wasn't really there. The motel's neon sign flickered in the distance. No matter how far I ran, it was like the whole town was a loop, a trap that had folded in on itself. But I kept running. I had to. The thing that wore the woman's face was still standing behind me, mouth open too wide, its hollow expression locked onto me. And behind her, more figures, standing in the shadows, silent, watching, waiting. I didn't want to know what happened if they caught me. I took a sharp turn into an alley, my breath ragged, my legs burning. The walls on either side of me felt too close together, too smooth. Then the whisper. It came from above me. "You have to remember." I snapped my head up. Something was crawling down the wall. Long limbs, too many of them. Its face was stretched, warped, too familiar. It was me. Its mouth opened, and the whisper became a scream. I bolted. I burst from the alley, staggering into the street, and stopped dead. I was back in front of the motel, the same neon sign buzzing weakly, the same man at the door, holding the key. "Welcome back," he said. I stumbled backward, shaking my head. "No," I choked out. "No, I left." "You never left," he said. And then I remembered. A flood of memories. I had been here before. I had done this before. Every time, I had tried to escape. And every time, I had ended up back here. "You always forget," the man said, stepping closer. "But this time, maybe you'll remember." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay focused. I still had the note, the one the woman had given me before she was taken. I reached into my pocket, unfolding it with shaking fingers. The words were clear now. "There's only one way out. You have to remember." I forced myself to think. What was I forgetting? Why couldn't I leave? The answer came to me slowly. This wasn't just a town. It wasn't just a highway. It was a loop, a prison, a memory that wouldn't let go of me. And I had been trapped in it for a long, long time. The lights of the motel flickered. The man in the suit watched me, waiting. The figures in the shadows were moving now, creeping forward. I had seconds before they reached me. I looked down at the note again. One last line had appeared. "There's a door. You have to find it." I spun around. A door. I had never seen a door out of this place. Then, the air shifted. A flicker of movement near the alley. A dark, narrow passage that hadn't been there before. I didn't hesitate. I ran. The whispering behind me grew louder. The ground beneath me shook. The motel sign exploded in a burst of sparks. The figures broke into a sprint. They were coming. I reached the passage and threw myself into the darkness. I hit the ground hard. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. The sound vanished. No whispering, no footsteps, just stillness. I looked up. I wasn't in the town anymore. I was in a room, small, empty. A single flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling. And in front of me, a door. It was wooden, plain. Something about it felt familiar, like I had seen it before, like I had been here before. I stepped closer, reaching for the handle, and then, the whisper returned. "You have to choose." I spun around, and saw two versions of myself, one standing in the doorway, the other watching from the shadows. Neither of them spoke, but I understood. This was the moment, the choice. One door would let me leave. The other would trap me here forever. I took a deep breath, and I listened. For the first time, I truly listened. The whispers weren't random. They were memories, pieces of my past. The first time I had driven this road. The first time I had stopped. The first time I had been trapped. And in that moment, I remembered everything. This wasn't just a town. It wasn't a place. It was a loop of my own making. A cycle of fear. And there was only one way out. I turned toward the right door. The figures in the shadows hissed. They knew what I was about to do. I reached for the handle, and the world trembled. The floor cracked open beneath me. A voice screamed. I twisted the knob, and everything exploded into white. I gasped, blinking against the harsh morning sunlight. I was sitting in my car. The engine was running. The road stretched ahead of me, bathed in dawn's golden light. My phone buzzed. Service restored. The clock read 8:42 a.m. and the road sign ahead, it read exit to Highway 17. I let out a slow, shaking breath. It was over. I was out. But then, something shifted in my peripheral vision. I turned my head, and in the rearview mirror, I saw the town, still there, still waiting, and at the edge of the road, a figure stood, watching me. It was wearing my face, and it was smiling.